Prologue. For years, I was entirely content just to look. The world around me operated like a chaotic, noisy machine. But if you stood still enough, you could see the gears turning. I viewed women not as people, but as intricate, flawed symbols. Glass houses waiting for a stone. Their fragility was a structural defect I couldn't look away from. In my early 20s, the obsession was purely observational. I would spend hours standing in the damp, freezing alleyways behind the university apartments. I would remain perfectly still in the shadows, my breath pluming in the bitter winter air, watching the glowing rectangles of ground floor windows. Those windows were museum displays. I cataloged the messy, pathetic ways people behaved when they thought no one was watching them. I mapped their insecurities, analyzing the desperate glances at their phones and the rehearsed smiles they practiced in their mirrors before facing the world. I learned the exact structural weaknesses of the human ego. But eventually, observing a collapsing building wasn't enough. Passive consumption lost its thrill. I wanted to be the one to swing the hammer. Her name was Sarah. She wasn't a grand project, just an accident of impulse, a prototype for a dark, entirely new architecture I was itching to design. I spent 3 months tracking her route from her cramped apartment to a used bookstore. I spent every afternoon sitting on the same damp wooden park bench, blending perfectly into the background noise of her life. I watched her apologize to people who bumped into her on the sidewalk, noting the way her shoulders hitched defensively, broadcasting a desperate need to shrink. I watched the frantic, clumsy way she dug for her keys at her front door, a nervous prey animal totally unaware of her surroundings. I didn't just study her. I built a perfect mirror. The introduction was a calculated masterpiece that took place on a rainy Tuesday. I orchestrated a meticulously timed collision outside a grocery store. I intentionally dropped a bag of apples at her feet, mimicking her exact stuttering, apologetic cadence as I scrambled to pick them up. Sarah helped me, completely oblivious to the fact that she was handing the wolf the keys to her front door. She saw a kindred spirit. I saw Mark. Within a month, I had engineered a soulmate persona built entirely out of her deepest, unspoken desires. I was patient. I was charming, smoothing over her anxieties with a practiced, soothing rhythm. I made her believe she was the center of my universe, the only thing grounding me. The illusion held perfectly until a cold night in November, exactly 3 years ago. We were sitting on the floor of her apartment, drinking cheap wine out of mismatched glasses. Sarah was laughing, her head resting heavily on my shoulder, talking endlessly about a sister she missed back home. I looked down at her, feeling absolutely nothing. The thrill of the chase had evaporated. The challenge of the hunt was over. The blueprint was complete. The foundation was poured, and suddenly the house bored me to tears. I didn't want to play the perfect boyfriend anymore. I wanted to see what was underneath the drywall. When I finally reached out and wrapped my hands around her throat, Sarah didn't even fight back at first. Her eyes widened in utter, heartbreaking confusion. Her mind was completely unable to process that her sanctuary was actively killing her. She stared at me, waiting for the punchline, waiting for the gentle man she loved to let go. By the time her survival instinct finally kicked in and she began to claw at my arms, it was far too late. My grip was mechanical, absolute, and merciless. It was a messy, brutal violation. I watched the light leave her eyes with the detached fascination of a man watching a demolition. There was no grand revelation, just the quiet collapse of a flawed structure. I cleaned the apartment with surgical precision. I wiped down every surface, leaving no physical evidence, no digital footprint, and absolutely no reason for the police to suspect the charming, quiet man she had been seeing. I walked out into the freezing night air, completely untethered and brilliantly awake. Sarah was the first. She was the trial run that taught me how to build the cage. Now, armed with the perfect blueprint, I just needed to find someone worthy of being locked inside it.
Chapter 1. The Diner.
I left the laminated menu face down on the sticky Formica table. The diner smelled of scorched coffee, heavy fryer grease, and the sharp tang of ammonia from a freshly mopped floor. It was the kind of heavy industrial scent that clung to your clothes for hours, a cheap perfume of desperation and early mornings. A neon sign buzzed erratically in the front window, casting a flickering, jaundiced light over the cracked vinyl booths and the exhausted patrons occupying them. I took a slow sip from a chipped white mug. The coffee was lukewarm and bitter. I didn't mind. Comfort wasn't the goal today, proximity was. The corner booth gave me a clear, unobstructed line of sight to the front counter. She was sitting 2 tables away, facing the street. Clara. She was laughing at something the waitress, an older woman with a severe perm and a stained apron, had just said. The sound was loud, a little too raw for the subdued morning crowd of exhausted commuters and shift workers. It was a practiced laugh, a defensive maneuver designed to make her seem agreeable and harmless to the people around her. Clara reached up, tucking a stray piece of brown hair behind her ear. I watched the nervous, constant friction of her thumb against her ceramic mug. I had spent 3 weeks cataloging the physical manifestations of her anxiety. I knew her fingernails were bitten down to the quick, the jagged edges a testament to the thoughts constantly chewing away inside her head. I knew the heavy gray cardigan she wore almost every day was missing its bottom button. It was a cheap, fraying piece of armor that swallowed her frame, hiding her posture and signaling to the world that she desperately wished to remain invisible. My father used to sit in the velvet-draped parlor of my childhood home, the air thick with pipe smoke and dust motes. The old man would stand slightly off-center from the window, watching the street through a narrow gap in the curtains. He would spend hours muttering about the predictable, ugly habits of our neighbors, the way the postman dragged his left foot, the secret drinking habit of the woman across the street. I had hated the suffocating silence of that room as a boy, the paranoid isolation of it all, but I finally understood the lesson. Watching gave you the blueprint. People were messy, chaotic things, but if you observed them long enough, their flaws formed a perfect structural grid. They all had a load-bearing wall, and once you found it, bringing them down was completely effortless. Clara stood up, her chair scraping violently against the linoleum. She fumbled with her oversized canvas tote bag, digging frantically for her wallet like a woman trying to defuse a bomb. Her grip slipped. A handful of loose change clattered against the table and scattered across the filthy floor.
"Oh gosh, I'm sorry."
She stammered, her face flushing a deep, mottled red. The panic in her eyes was instantaneous. She scrambled under the table, dropping to her knees to chase quarters under the adjacent booths. The waitress told her not to worry about it, waving a dismissive hand, but Clara kept apologizing, her voice tight with an entirely disproportionate amount of panic. She wasn't just embarrassed. She was terrified of the spotlight. I set my mug down. I didn't move to help her. I rested my chin on my steepled fingers and watched the frantic, clumsy way she existed in the world. She was terrified of drawing attention, terrified of taking up space, and completely unaware that the most dangerous thing in the room was sitting 30 feet away, memorizing the exact shade of her embarrassment. The bell above the door jingled as she practically fled the diner, clutching her bag to her chest like a shield. I didn't rush. I watched the gray cardigan disappear into the morning foot traffic. I waited exactly 2 minutes, letting the distance stretch. I pulled a crisp $5 bill from my money clip, laid it perfectly flat on the table, and slipped out into the cold Tuesday morning to follow her.
Chapter 2. The View from Here. Chapter 2. The View from Here.
The wind coming off the street corner was biting, carrying the sharp metallic scent of impending snow and exhaust fumes. I pulled my fraying gray cardigan tighter around my throat, burying my chin in the cheap wool. I kept my head angled perfectly downward, letting myself merge with the morning crush of dark suits and beige trench coats marching blindly toward the financial district. If you walked fast enough and looked miserable enough, no one bothered to look at your face. Halfway down the block, the sleek, imposing shape of a police cruiser sat idling at a red light. A cold, heavy knot immediately tightened at the base of my stomach. My mouth went dry, my tongue sticking to the roof of my mouth. It had been 3 years since the audit triggered the alarm. 3 agonizing years since I had scrambled out the window of my ground floor apartment in Pennsylvania with nothing but a canvas duffel bag and a pounding headache, leaving a $5 million crater in the firm's offshore accounts. I knew the spike of fear was deeply irrational. I knew the bored-beat cops grabbing their morning bagels in a city of millions didn't care about a missing mid-level accountant from a rusted-out town no one could locate on a map. They were looking for violent criminals, not a woman who moved numbers on a spreadsheet. But logic rarely mattered to my nervous system. My heart still hammered a frantic, sickening rhythm against my ribs, convinced that every siren was finally coming for me. I purposefully locked my eyes onto the cracked pavement, forcing myself to slow my pace just a fraction. Running drew eyes. I had to ensure I didn't look like a woman in a hurry, just another drone late for a meeting. I didn't take a proper, full breath until I finally reached the towering, heavy glass doors of my office building. It was supposed to be my sanctuary. But the lobby security guard, a heavy-set retired cop named Davis, stepped squarely into my path. "Badge, please, miss." My heart seized, skipping a violent beat. I had walked past Davis every single weekday for 2 years, offering the same polite nod, and he had never once stopped me. For a blinding, terrifying second, the ground felt like it was dropping out from under me. I thought the audit had finally caught up. I thought there were federal agents waiting in the elevator bank. My hands shook violently as I dug into the bottomless depths of my oversized canvas tote bag, my knuckles scraping raw against the harsh metal zipper. I practically shoved the cheap plastic ID at his chest. Davis just gave a gruff nod, barely glancing at the faded photo, and stepped aside to let me pass. It took every ounce of willpower I possessed not to sprint directly to the elevators and hit the call button until it broke. I swiped my plastic badge at the security turnstile. Beep. That sharp, artificial electronic chime grounded me. It was a digital stamp of approval. Here, under the fluorescent lights, I wasn't Sarah Jenkins, the terrified fugitive. I was just Clara, the quiet, agreeable accounts manager who kept her spreadsheets obsessively color-coded and her desk impeccably clean. Clara didn't steal millions of dollars. Clara barely spoke above a whisper. The morning dragged by in a haze of numbers and forced politeness. The brutal fluorescent overhead lights hummed with a constant low-frequency buzz that dug a dull headache right in behind my eyes. At exactly 10:15 a.m., the regional manager, Gregson, stopped abruptly at the edge of my fabric-walled cubicle. He dropped a thick, unfastened manila folder squarely onto the center of my desk. The loose papers instantly slid out, cascading messily over my meticulously organized keyboard and spilling onto the floor. "The Lawson account is missing a 0 on the quarterly deductions, Clara," Gregson said. His voice was booming, intentionally loud enough to carry across the dead silence of the open-plan floor. "I need this fixed before lunch. We can't afford these amateur mistakes." I hadn't even touched the Lawson account. It was Gregson's own personal file, a mistake he was clearly too proud to admit to. But arguing with him meant drawing a crowd. I felt the sudden, burning physical weight of 5 different coworkers pausing their typing and turning to look at me. Attention was a massive, blaring spotlight, and spotlights got you caught. "I'm sorry, Mr. Gregson," I said quickly, my voice slipping into a thin, reedy whisper that I hated. "I'll fix it right now." I scrambled to gather the scattered documents, pulling the papers tightly toward my chest. I kept my head perfectly bowed, staring at the gray carpet until I heard his heavy wingtips finally walk away. I spent the next 4 hours blindly reconciling quarterly expense reports. Every time a coworker stopped by my cubicle to complain about the broken coffee machine or the weather, I offered up the same polite, entirely empty smile. It was an exhausting, non-stop performance of normalcy. By the time the digital clock in the corner of my screen finally hit noon, my shoulders ached and I felt like I had been holding my breath all morning. I grabbed my canvas bag and practically jogged down the lobby steps, desperate for natural light. Elena was already waiting by the glass revolving doors, balancing two massive, sweating iced coffees in one hand. She was a force of nature. Today, she was wearing a sharp, tailored maroon blazer that made my fraying cardigan feel instantly underdressed and pathetic. "You look like you're about to jump right out of your skin," Elena noted immediately, assessing me with narrowed eyes as she held out one of the plastic cups. "Just too much screen time?" I lied smoothly, taking the cold coffee and consciously forcing my rigid shoulders to physically drop an inch. "I think the fluorescent lights on the fourth floor are actually trying to kill me."
"I told you to request a desk move a month ago," Elena said, rolling her eyes. She hooked her arm firmly through mine and began steering me out onto the chaotic, crowded sidewalk, effortlessly parting the sea of pedestrians. "You have to advocate for yourself, Clara. They'll just walk all over you if you don't." I managed a tight, unconvincing smile. If you only knew, I thought bitterly. Advocating for myself meant existing, and existing was dangerous. We walked 3 noisy blocks to the Ivy Terrace, a narrow, painfully trendy open-air bistro crammed tightly between 2 towering glass office buildings. The patio was already packed shoulder to shoulder. It was a chaotic, echoing blur of overlapping corporate conversations, harsh laughter, and clinking silverware that made my head spin. Elena ruthlessly navigated us through the maze of chairs to a cramped, wobbly metal table near the iron railing, unceremoniously dropping her heavy leather tote onto the spare chair to claim our territory. "Okay, so I saw the event listings this morning," Elena said, leaning aggressively over the tiny table before I had even managed to unzip my jacket. "Gallery Walk is this Saturday. It's supposed to be massive. The entire warehouse district is opening up." I took a long, desperate drink of my iced coffee. The brutally cold liquid shocked my system awake, pushing back the edges of the headache. I saw the posters taped up near the train station. I was actually thinking of maybe heading down there. "We are going," Elena corrected instantly, pointing a sharp, French-manicured finger at me like a weapon. "I refuse to let you spend another entire weekend sitting alone in your dark apartment. You need to get out. You need to actually meet people who don't work in accounting and don't wear lanyards." "I meet people," I protested weakly, fully aware of how pathetic it sounded. "Food delivery drivers absolutely do not count." Elena laughed loudly, pulling a laminated menu from the metal holder in the center of the table. "Saturday, 2 o'clock. We'll walk around and look at some overpriced, confusing art. I'll complain endlessly about the crowds, and we'll get incredibly strong drinks after." "Fine," I smiled. For the first time since I saw the police cruiser that morning, the rigid tension in my jaw finally eased a fraction. Elena was exhausting, but she was normal, and right now, I desperately needed to draft in her wake. 2 o'clock.
Chapter 3. The Setup, Silas. The heavy, rhythmic idle of my black truck reverberated against the stained concrete pillars of the underground parking garage. I sat perfectly still behind the leather-wrapped steering wheel, staring blankly at the damp concrete wall ahead. The digital dash clock read 1:15 p.m. I cut the engine. The sudden silence in the cab was absolute. A heavy, pressurized vacuum broken only by the faint metallic ticking of the cooling exhaust. I didn't get out right away. Patience was the difference between an amateur and an architect. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror, smoothing a microscopic crease in the collar of my dark charcoal sweater. I had chosen the garment with intense deliberation. It was an obscenely expensive cashmere blend, but the soft wool achieved a specific psychological goal. It made me look grounded, warm, and entirely approachable. It completely shed the rigid, predatory intimidation of the bespoke suits I wore during the week. Clara was a skittish animal. If I approached her looking like corporate armor, she would bolt. I needed to look like a sanctuary. Stepping out into the humid, oppressive Saturday afternoon, I walked the 2 short blocks to the gallery. The venue was exactly what I expected. A massive, drafty, converted warehouse in the decaying industrial district, aggressively rebranded for the city's artistic elite. It smelled intensely of ozone, cheap boxed wine, and wet brick. Exposed steel girders crisscrossed the cavernous ceiling, and a labyrinth of temporary drywall partitions had been hastily erected to form a confusing, claustrophobic maze of exhibits. I paid the exorbitant entry fee in cash and spent 20 minutes methodically walking the floor. I wasn't looking at the art. I was analyzing the structural flow of the room. I was looking at the sight lines. I noted where the overhead lighting was harsh and unflattering, where the foot traffic inevitably jammed up near the bar, and where the blind spots were. I was looking for the path of least resistance for a woman who was already prone to panic attacks. I found exactly what I needed near the back of the North Hall, a dead-end alcove displaying a series of stark, black-and-white architectural sketches. It was dimly lit, intentionally isolated from the chaotic main bar, and completely devoid of foot traffic. If a highly anxious person felt overwhelmed by the crushing crush of bodies on the main floor, this was the exact, quiet corner their instincts would drive them to retreat to. I left the alcove and tracked down the DJ. The kid was set up near the drafty front doors, hunched lazily over a folding table cluttered with tangled wires and a sticker-covered laptop. He was blasting a repetitive thumping electronic beat that actively rattled the thin drywall and made conversation impossible. He looked profoundly bored, blankly chewing on a torn thumbnail. I walked directly up to the side of the table. "Excuse me." The kid didn't hear me over the heavy bass. I didn't raise my voice. I simply reached out and tapped the plastic table once, hard. The DJ looked up, pulling one heavy headphone off his ear with a deeply irritated frown. "Yeah? What?" I pulled a folded $100 bill from my money clip and slid it slowly across the plastic table, pressing my index finger firmly over George Franklin's face. The DJ's eyes immediately darted down to the cash, his manufactured irritation evaporating into sudden, sharp interest. "At exactly 2:15, I need you to completely cut this track," I said, my voice level and dead serious. "I want you to play Shostakovich's Waltz No. 2. Do you have it?" The kid blinked, genuinely confused. "Like classical music? Man, that's going to clear the floor. People are trying to drink." "I don't care about the floor," I said. I didn't break eye contact. I slid a second $100 bill out of the clip and placed it meticulously next to the first. 2:15. Let it play for exactly 3 minutes, and then you can go back to whatever this noise is. The kid snatched the bills before I could change my mind, shoving them quickly into his front jeans pocket. "Yeah, okay. 2:15. Shostakovich. You got it, man." I turned and walked away before he could ask any pointless questions. I navigated back through the growing, suffocating crowd, letting the bodies part around me until I returned to the deep shadows of the architectural exhibit. I leaned my shoulder against the cool, rough brick wall, checked the second hand on my watch, and waited for the trap to spring.
The
Chapter
warehouse
4.
was suffocating.
The variable.
Before Pennsylvania,
Clara.
before the offshore accounts and the burner phones, I used to love the kinetic energy of a packed room. Now, all I felt was the lack of exits. The air in the gallery was thick, heavy with the cloying smell of cheap perfume, damp wool coats, and stifling body heat. The electronic music thumping from the front of the venue was a physical assault, the heavy bass vibrating right in my teeth and rattling my ribcage. "Stop doing the flight risk thing," Elena shouted over the overwhelming bass, grabbing my elbow as we squeezed past a loud group of men in thick-rimmed glasses. "I'm not doing anything," I shouted back. It was a lie. I was actively, frantically scanning the sprawling crowd for security guards or badges. Every man wearing a dark jacket made my stomach clench with absolute terror. "It's just a gallery walk," I reminded myself, discreetly wiping a cold bead of sweat from my collarbone. "Nobody is looking for you here." Elena relentlessly dragged me through 3 different crowded exhibits, enthusiastically critiquing abstract oil paintings. To me, they just looked like violent smears of color on canvas. I desperately tried to focus on the brushstrokes and tried to nod at the appropriate times, but the exposed brick walls of the warehouse felt like they were inching closer together. The sheer volume of the noise was a physical weight pressing down hard on my shoulders. Oh my God, look at the welding on that. Elena gasped suddenly. She pointed across the chaotic main floor toward a massive, jagged metal sculpture that was drawing a crowd. I have to see that up close. Stay right here. I'll be right back. Elena, wait. It was too late. Elena had already plunged headfirst into the sea of bodies, weaving effortlessly through the crowd and disappearing completely from my sight. Suddenly untethered from my anchor, I felt a massive spike of genuine, suffocating panic. A tall man bumped roughly into my shoulder as he passed, carelessly spilling a few dark drops of red wine onto the concrete floor. He didn't even bother to apologize. I immediately backed up, desperate to get out of the main current of foot traffic before I was crushed. I retreated down a narrow, shadowy hallway, walking backward until my shoulder blades hit the solid, cool surface of an exposed brick wall. I let out a long, shaky exhale. I had stumbled into a quiet alcove where the pounding bass of the main floor was finally muffled. I closed my eyes for a long second, willing my racing heart to slow down and reminding myself to breathe. When I opened them, I realized I was standing directly in front of a series of stark black and white charcoal sketches. They were incredibly detailed drawings of brutalist concrete buildings, stark, oppressive, and entirely devoid of people. I stared intently at a drawing of a towering hospital wing, tracing the heavy, suffocating lines with my eyes. At exactly 2:15 p.m., the throbbing electronic bass abruptly cut off. The sudden, total silence was deeply jarring. A few people out on the main floor laughed loudly in confusion, wondering if a breaker had blown. A second later, the sweeping, haunting strings of a full orchestra swelled through the warehouse speakers. The classical waltz was so entirely out of place in the industrial setting that I actually let out a short, startled laugh. The heavy, painful tension in my chest loosened just a fraction. It was a bizarre transition, but the music was undeniably beautiful. It's a bit grim, isn't it? The low voice came from my right. I jumped, my defensive walls slamming back into place instantly as the adrenaline spiked. I spun around, ready to bolt. The man standing a few feet away wasn't even looking at me. He was staring intently at the exact same hospital sketch I had been focused on. He was wearing an expensive dark charcoal sweater, his broad shoulders relaxed, his hands pushed casually deep into his pockets. He didn't look like an undercover cop, and he didn't radiate the aggressive threat of a predator. He just looked like a quiet guy killing time in a corner. "Excuse me?" I asked, my voice tight and defensive. He turned his head slowly. His eyes were a startling, clear amber. He didn't do the exhausting thing most men in the city did. He didn't look me up and down to assess my value, and he didn't step aggressively into my personal space. "The sketch?" he said, nodding respectfully toward the brick wall. "The artist spent hours rendering the concrete, but if you look at the windows, there are no doors anywhere in the building. It's supposed to be a hospital, but it's drawn like a prison." I looked back at the drawing, squinting hard in the dim overhead light. I hadn't noticed the architectural flaw, but he was exactly right. The ground floor was just a solid, impenetrable block of shading. "That's incredibly depressing," I said. The man offered a small, self-deprecating smile that reached his amber eyes. "I'm Silas, and I apologize for lurking. The main floor was giving me a migraine." "Clara," I replied. For the first time all day, my rigid shoulders finally dropped from their defensive hunch. "And I understand. I was hiding too." "A very reasonable strategy," Silas said warmly. Before I could say anything else, hurried footsteps echoed sharply down the concrete alcove. Elena practically skidded to a halt, miraculously holding 2 plastic cups of wine without spilling them. She stopped dead in her tracks when she saw me standing alone with a strange man. Her protective instincts flared immediately. Her eyes darted from Silas's face down to his hands, assessing him as a threat in a split second. "Am I interrupting?" Elena asked. Her tone was falsely bright, but her eyes were sharp with immediate, piercing suspicion. Silas didn't try to charm her with a sleazy smile, and he didn't puff his chest out to assert dominance. He simply took a deliberate, physical half-step backward, immediately giving us both more space to breathe. Not at all, Silas said evenly, keeping his hands visibly tucked in his pockets to show he wasn't a threat. He looked back at me. It was nice meeting you, Clara. Enjoy the rest of the exhibit. He gave Elena a polite, entirely deferential nod and turned to start walking away. I felt a sudden, surprising jolt of deep disappointment. Men in this city were always so aggressive. They pushed boundaries. They demanded phone numbers and attention without earning it. Silas was just leaving. He had offered a moment of quiet safety, and now he was walking away. Wait, I said. The word slipped out of my mouth before I could overthink it and stop myself. Silas paused, turning back around slowly. Elena shot me a wildly bewildered look, shocked that I was initiating contact, but I completely ignored her. I didn't want to go back out into the suffocating crowd on the main floor just yet. I wanted to stay in the quiet bubble he had created. We were actually just going to find the bar, I said, my heart beating a little faster at my own boldness. If you want to walk with us? Silas looked at me, his amber eyes completely blank and unreadable for a tiny fraction of a second, before that soft, easy smile returned to his face. I'd like that. Chapter 5. The Wedge. Clara. The bar located just down the street from the warehouse was a narrow, claustrophobic tunnel of a room. It smelled intensely of spilled beer that had soaked into the floorboards, bitter citrus peels, and the damp, heavy scent of wet wool coats. The thumping bass from the gallery was gone, replaced by the deafening, chaotic roar of 50 people trying to shout over a blaring jukebox. I pressed my back hard against the cracked, sticky leather booth, pulling my fraying cardigan tight around my waist to avoid brushing against the damp strangers squeezing past our table. I'll get the drinks, Silas had said the very moment we walked in, smoothly stepping away into the crowd before Elena could even argue or offer to pay. Now, Elena and I stood waiting in the suffocating crush of bodies. Elena was up on her toes, craning her neck to keep a sharp eye on Silas through the shifting crowd at the bar. He's weirdly calm, isn't he? Elena shouted over the overwhelming noise, her eyes narrowed in acute, critical observation. Most guys would be sweating right now, trying to figure out how to talk to both of us at once or aggressively trying to buy my approval. He's just standing there. I looked over. Silas was waiting patiently behind a disorganized row of shouting patrons. He wasn't anxiously checking his phone to look busy, and he wasn't nervously looking around the room to assess the competition. He was just resting his large, capable hands lightly on the brass rail, perfectly, unnervingly still amidst the chaos. He's just polite, I yelled back over the music, though I felt a strange, deeply defensive flutter in my chest. A few minutes later, Silas reappeared, expertly maneuvering through the tight, jostling spaces without spilling a single drop. He handed Elena a full glass of white wine and smoothly passed me a cold gin and tonic. He held a short glass of club soda with a lime wedge for himself. Not drinking? Elena asked, taking a generous sip of her wine. It wasn't a hostile question, but with Elena, it was definitely an interrogation. I have to drive later, Silas said smoothly, taking a slow sip of the sparkling water. I try not to mix heavy city traffic with alcohol. Responsible? Elena noted, leaning back against the sticky booth next to me. So, Silas, you know we're in accounting. What do you do? Architecture, he replied. He had to lean in slightly so his deep voice would carry over the jukebox. Mostly commercial restoration, taking old gutted buildings downtown and making them structurally sound again. Must be exhausting, Elena said, swirling her wine. Dealing with all that city red tape. It has its moments, Silas agreed, his amber eyes shifting deliberately from her to me. But it's usually worth it. People tend to overlook the things that look a little worn down. I took a sharp, desperate sip of my gin. The alcohol burned a harsh path down the back of my throat, sending a sudden flush of heat straight to my cheeks. He was looking right at me. And A terrifying second, I felt like he could see straight through the fraying gray cardigan, straight through the fake name on my badge, right down to the paranoid, terrified runaway underneath. Clara's the real expert at navigating the city, though. Elena jumped in, wrapping a protective arm loosely around my rigid shoulders. She moved here 3 years ago and completely reinvented herself. I'm basically just her tour guide at this point to make sure she doesn't get lost. It was a standard joke between us, one she repeated often, meant to be endearing. But as Silas looked slowly from Elena's arm to my flushed face, I felt a sudden hot prickle of profound embarrassment. Silas took another slow, measured sip of his club soda. A tour guide. That's a lot of responsibility, Elena. Someone's got to keep her out of trouble. Elena laughed loudly. Silas didn't laugh. He just nodded, his expression shifting into something deeply thoughtful and incredibly observant. It makes sense. Moving to a new city alone is a massive shock to the system. Most transplants I work with carry that tension in their bodies for years. He looked directly at me, his voice dropping just enough that I actively had to strain forward to hear him over the bar noise. You hold your shoulders like you're constantly bracing for an impact. It's lucky you have someone to run interference for you. The table went dead silent. I froze, my fingers gripping the sweaty plastic cup so hard the sides crinkled audibly. He hadn't called me weak. He hadn't said I was broken. He hadn't asked a single invasive question about my past. He had just pointed out a physical fact, my rigid defensive posture, and instantly validated Elena's role as my necessary protector. But hearing it spoken out loud made my stomach turn violently, bracing for an impact. I realized exactly how I looked to him, like a fragile, skittish animal that couldn't survive 30 minutes in a crowded room without a babysitter. Helena looked entirely pleased with the assessment, completely oblivious to the sudden vibrating tension radiating from me. Exactly. She works too hard. She worries way too much, and she needs to let loose. Silas offered a small, polite smile, raising his glass slightly in Elena's direction. He had placed the wedge perfectly. He had masterfully stroked the protector's ego while making the prey deeply, uncomfortably aware of her own leash. I looked down at the melting ice in my gin, a sudden, unfamiliar surge of dark resentment flaring hot in my chest. I didn't want to be Elena's project anymore, and I desperately didn't want Silas to see me as one. Chapter 6. The Distance. Clara/Silas. The cold evening air hit us like a physical blow as we stepped out of the crowded, suffocating bar. The city street was slick with a fresh, icy drizzle, and the neon signs from the closed storefronts bled harsh red and blue across the wet, black pavement. I shivered, wrapping my arms tightly around myself. The gin had worn off, leaving behind a jittery, nervous energy humming under my skin. I desperately wanted to keep talking to Silas. I wanted to prove to him that I wasn't just a nervous, fragile transplant hiding behind my loud friend. I wanted him to see me. But Silas was already zipping up his dark wool coat, creating a physical boundary.
Well, he said, stepping back toward the wet curb to give us space. I should let you two get back to your weekend. It was nice meeting you both. Elena blinked, clearly surprised. She was completely used to guys lingering pathetically on the sidewalk, trying to stretch the night out or awkwardly asking for my number while she stood right there judging them.
You're heading out? Pretty well. You don't have to settle for the loud tourist traps. Elena took the card, her eyebrows raised in mild impressiveness. Thanks, Silas. Drive safe.
Silas finally looked at me. He didn't step closer. He didn't try to touch my arm or force a lingering, dramatic stare. He just held my gaze for 2 seconds, just long enough for me to feel the absolute focused weight of his attention, and gave a sharp, polite nod. Good night, Clara.
Good night, I managed to say, my voice embarrassingly small against the noise of the passing traffic. He turned and walked down the block, his dark coat quickly blending into the heavy shadows of the street. I watched him go, a hollow ache of profound disappointment settling deep in my chest. He hadn't asked for my number. He hadn't even tried.
Wow,
Elena said, looking down at the crisp business card, then back up at the empty street. Okay, that is a first. He actually just left. Yeah, I said, trying desperately to keep my voice light. He's different, Elena mused, carefully tucking the card into her leather tote. A little intense, but grounded. He didn't even try to push for anything. I nodded slowly, staring at the empty spot where he had disappeared. He didn't push. It was the most attractive thing a man had done since I moved to the city. He had given me total space. He had handed the control entirely over to us, leaving the door cracked open just an inch. As we walked toward the train station, I realized my heart was beating faster than it had all day. And it wasn't out of fear. It was pure curiosity. 3 blocks away, I unlocked my heavy black truck. I slid into the driver's seat, pulling the heavy door shut to completely seal out the obnoxious city noise. I turned the key. The aggressive, deep resonance of the custom exhaust rumbled to life, vibrating powerfully up through the floorboards. I gripped the leather steering wheel, staring out through the rain-streaked windshield. My face was completely slack. The polite, affable mask packed away the absolute second I turned the corner out of their sight. I didn't need to ask for her number. The play had been executed flawlessly. I had handed the bait directly to Elena, and she was performing her role to perfection.
Well, he said, stepping back toward the wet curb to give us space. I should let you two get back to your weekend. It was nice meeting you both. Elena blinked, clearly surprised. She was completely used to guys lingering pathetically on the sidewalk, trying to stretch the night out or awkwardly asking for my number while she stood right there judging them.
You're heading out? Pretty well. You don't have to settle for the loud tourist traps. Elena took the card, her eyebrows raised in mild impressiveness. Thanks, Silas. Drive safe.
Silas finally looked at me. He didn't step closer. He didn't try to touch my arm or force a lingering, dramatic stare. He just held my gaze for 2 seconds, just long enough for me to feel the absolute focused weight of his attention, and gave a sharp, polite nod.
Good night, Clara.
Good night, I managed to say, my voice embarrassingly small against the noise of the passing traffic. He turned and walked down the block, his dark coat quickly blending into the heavy shadows of the street. I watched him go, a hollow ache of profound disappointment settling deep in my chest. He hadn't asked for my number. He hadn't even tried.
Wow,
Elena said, looking down at the crisp business card, then back up at the empty street. Okay, that is a first. He actually just left. Yeah, I said, trying desperately to keep my voice light. He's different, Elena mused, carefully tucking the card into her leather tote. A little intense, but grounded. He didn't even try to push for anything. I nodded slowly, staring at the empty spot where he had disappeared. He didn't push. It was the most attractive thing a man had done since I moved to the city. He had given me total space. He had handed the control entirely over to us, leaving the door cracked open just an inch. As we walked toward the train station, I realized my heart was beating faster than it had all day. And it wasn't out of fear. It was pure curiosity. 3 blocks away, I unlocked my heavy black truck. I slid into the driver's seat, pulling the heavy door shut to completely seal out the obnoxious city noise. I turned the key. The aggressive, deep resonance of the custom exhaust rumbled to life, vibrating powerfully up through the floorboards. I gripped the leather steering wheel, staring out through the rain-streaked windshield. My face was completely slack. The polite, affable mask packed away the absolute second I turned the corner out of their sight.
I didn't need to ask for her number. The play had been executed flawlessly. I had handed the bait directly to Elena, and she was performing her role to perfection. Shown, completely unaware that her protector was the one quietly locking the gate behind her. By Tuesday, Clara would be the one reaching out to me, absolutely convinced it was her own idea. I reached for the gear shift, the cold, mechanical satisfaction settling deep in my chest. The foundation was poured, but as I checked my side mirror to pull out into the street, my eyes caught a shape in the reflection. A nondescript black sedan was idling at the mouth of the alley directly across from the bar. Its headlights were completely cut, but the faint, ghostly plume of exhaust rising in the freezing air meant the engine was running. It had heavily tinted windows, rendering the interior completely invisible. I froze, my hand still resting on the shifter. I watched the car for a full 60 seconds. It didn't move. It wasn't waiting for a parking spot. It was positioned with a perfect, unobstructed sightline of the exact door Clara and Elena had just walked out of. The cold satisfaction in my chest instantly vanished, replaced by a dark, territorial rage. I recognized the tactic because it was exactly how I hunted. Someone else was watching the flock. For a split second, I calculated if they were looking for me, a ghost from a past demolition. But no. As Clara and Elena walked toward the subway, the sedan slowly rolled out of the alley, keeping its lights off until it was a block behind them. I memorized the license plate as it passed under a street lamp. I shifted my truck into drive, my jaw clenching. The game had just changed. I wasn't the only predator circling her anymore, and I absolutely refused to let someone else tear down my house. Chapter 7. The Restraint. Silas. The rooftop garden was supposed to be closed to the public after 9, but I pushed open the heavy iron gate without breaking stride. I didn't brag about knowing the building manager or paying someone off to get us up here. I just held the gate for Clara like it was expected, a silent demonstration of access and control. The air up here was thin and freezing, biting harshly through Clara's thin jacket. Below us, the city was a sprawling grid of taillights and street lamps, the noise reduced to a dull, ocean-like roar. Up here, we were completely isolated. I stood near the concrete parapet, 2 plastic cups of expensive red wine resting on the ledge. I didn't feel cold. I watched the bitter wind whip a strand of Clara's hair across her face. For a fraction of a second, the way she shivered reminded me of the first one. I hadn't thought about the first girl in 3 years. I remembered the damp wood of the park bench where I used to sit for hours, tracking her predictable route to the bookstore. I remembered dropping my groceries right in front of her on a rainy Tuesday, perfectly mimicking her clumsy, apologetic cadence. I had built a mirror for her, reflecting back exactly what she wanted to see, and she had walked right into it. But Sarah was a simple structure. Clara was a fortress actively under siege. I had spent the last 3 days tracking the black sedan that had trailed her from the bar. I knew she was running from something massive, and that hidden terror made her incredibly fragile. Clara took a step closer to the ledge, wrapping her arms around herself to stop the trembling. "It's freezing." "We can go back down," I offered easily, my voice a low, steady hum over the wind. I gave her the illusion of an exit. "No," Clara said quickly, almost desperately. "No, I like it up here." She took another step, closing the distance between us until I could feel the faint heat radiating off her skin. She was flushed, the wine softening the rigid defensive posture she usually carried like a shield. She looked up at me, her eyes wide and searching. "You do this thing," she murmured, her voice slightly breathless, fighting against the wind. "You just watch. It's like you're trying to figure out how I work." "I am," I said. I didn't smile. I reached out, my bare hand brushing the side of her neck. My fingers were ice cold against her skin. I pressed my thumb directly over her carotid artery. I felt her pulse jump, a frantic, heavy thud against my thumb. She didn't pull away. She leaned her weight into my palm, her eyes fluttering shut in complete, blinding trust. I kissed her. It wasn't gentle. I closed my hand around the back of her neck, pulling her flush against my chest with a sudden, bruising force. Clara made a soft, surprised sound in the back of her throat, her hands coming up to grip the lapels of my wool coat like she was drowning. She kissed me back with a sudden, desperate heat, her body pressing into the hard line of mine. It was messy. She tasted like wine and panicked adrenaline. I felt her fingers tangle in my hair, felt the complete, terrifying surrender in the way her knees buckled slightly against me. I had her. The panic was gone, replaced by a blind, consuming hunger to be anchored to something solid. I could take her back to my apartment right now. She would go. Instead, I broke the kiss. I pulled back slowly, deliberately dragging the separation out. My hands dropped from her neck to her shoulders to steady her trembling frame. Clara stood there, her chest heaving, her lips parted and swollen from the force of it. She looked completely disoriented, blinking up at me in the dim light of the city grid as her brain struggled to process the abrupt loss of contact. "I'm sorry," I said softly. I stepped back, putting a solid foot of freezing air between us. "I don't want to rush this, Clara. Not tonight." The disappointment that flashed across her face was sharp and immediate, a visceral reaction to being denied, but it was quickly swallowed by something else. Awe. She was looking at me like I was a saint. "Okay," she whispered, her voice shaking uncontrollably in the cold. I picked up her cup of wine from the ledge and handed it back to her, my fingers brushing hers just long enough to remind her of what she wasn't getting. I had given her just enough of the fire to keep her warm, and now I was going to let her freeze until she begged for more. Chapter 8. The Hangover. Clara. The coffee shop the next morning smelled heavily of burnt milk, wet umbrellas, and stale pastries. I sat crammed into the corner at a wobbly wooden table, my freezing hands wrapped tightly around a cheap paper cup just to siphon the heat. I hadn't slept a single minute. I had spent the entire night lying completely rigid in my bed, staring up at the jagged water stain on my apartment ceiling. Every time I closed my eyes, I just replayed the exact heavy pressure of Silas's hand on the back of my neck. My skin still felt feverishly hot where he had touched me. Usually, my anxiety was a cold, paralyzing dread about the audit. But this was different. I felt like I had dry swallowed 6 cups of espresso. It was a manic, jittery energy, humming violently right behind my ribs. Elena dropped unceremoniously into the metal chair across from me, violently shaking the rain off her umbrella before unbuttoning her slick trench coat. She didn't even say good morning. "You look completely insane," Elena said, squinting critically at my pale face. "Seriously, Clara, you look like you just walked away from a multi-car pileup. The bags under your eyes are purple. Did you even go home last night, or did you sleep on the street?" "I went home," I laughed, though the sound scraped out of my throat, tight and entirely breathless. Elena raised a perfectly arched eyebrow, leaning aggressively across the small table. "Okay, spill it. You guys left the bar, you essentially blew me off, and then what? Did you go back to his place?" I traced the raised plastic seam of my coffee lid with my thumb, my stomach doing a violent, nervous flip. "We went up to this private rooftop garden. We were just talking. The wind was freezing, and then—" "And then?" she prompted, entirely out of patience. "We kissed." I felt a sudden, humiliating heat rise immediately in my face, just saying the words out loud. "Elena, it was— I don't even know how to explain it. I've never felt anything like it. I didn't care about being careful. I practically threw myself at him. I was totally ready to go back to his place right then and there." Elena grinned, a triumphant, satisfied look crossing her face as she took a long sip of her vanilla latte. "Okay, so what's the problem? You hooked up with a hot architect. Why do you look like you're actively having a panic attack?" "Because he stopped," I said, my voice dropping instantly to a miserable whisper. Elena's victorious grin completely faltered. She set her mug down with a sharp clack. "Wait, he stopped? Like, he physically pushed you away? Did he change his mind?" "No, not like that." I shook my head frantically, feeling an intense, sudden need to defend him. "He didn't reject me. He pulled back. He held my shoulders to steady me. He said he didn't want to rush it. He specifically said, 'Not tonight.'" Elena sat back heavily in her metal chair, genuinely shocked. For a brief second, the bustling, clattering noise of the busy coffee shop seemed to completely fade out. "A guy in this city actually stopped making out with you on a dark, private rooftop because he wanted to be respectful. Are you sure he isn't a serial killer? I'm sure, I said. A fierce, almost irrational wave of protective pride blooming hot in my chest. He's patient, Elena. He isn't just treating me like a conquest. He actually wants to do this right. He made me feel completely safe. Elena stared at me for a long, calculating moment, silently processing the information. The hard, cynical skepticism she usually wore like a suit of armor slowly dissolved into genuine approval. Wow. Okay. I admit, I thought he was a little too quiet and intense yesterday, but that's incredibly decent of him, Clara. That's actual maturity. I know, I breathed, feeling a pathetic rush of relief that my friend approved of my obsession. Well, Elena smiled warmly, reaching across the sticky table to squeeze my cold hand. Don't mess it up. Guys with actual restraint don't exactly grow on trees around here. Play it cool. Make him wait. I squeezed her hand back, forcing a bright, agreeable smile. But beneath the table, hidden from her view, my leg was bouncing violently, entirely out of my control. Restraint. It was a beautiful, noble word. But as I stared down into the dark abyss of my black coffee, the desperate physical clawing need to see him again, to feel that crushing safety, didn't feel anything like a budding romance. It felt exactly like chemical withdrawal.
Chapter 9. The Footprint. Clara. The suffocating anxiety of waiting for Silas to text was suddenly, violently eclipsed on Tuesday morning by a much more immediate terror. I was sitting in my sterile gray cubicle, staring blankly at a dense spreadsheet until the numbers blurred together, when Mark from IT leaned heavily over the low fabric partition. He was holding a lukewarm, stained mug of coffee, wearing a thick blue lanyard loaded with jingling security badges. Mark was harmless, the kind of guy who spent his weekends building custom computers, but he was chronically bored, which made him incredibly dangerous to someone like me. "Hey, Clara," Mark said casually, tapping his knuckles against the edge of my desk. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet office. "I was trying to set up the new corporate directory for the regional site this morning. I went to pull your photo and work history off LinkedIn to port it over, but I couldn't find you," he explained, completely unaware that he had just casually dropped a bomb into my lap. The temperature in my veins plummeted instantly, leaving me ice cold. My fingers froze rigidly over the keyboard. "I don't have a LinkedIn," I said, carefully forcing my voice to stay light, breezy, and entirely disinterested. "Or Facebook. I'm not really a social media person." "Yeah, I figured." Mark chuckled lightly, taking a slow sip of his coffee. "But it's weird. I usually run a basic background trace to fill in the employment gaps for the directory. Standard HR stuff. But it's like you didn't exist before you moved here 3 years ago. No old high school tags, no public utility records in other states. You're a total ghost." My lungs seized completely, refusing to take in air. The constant low hum of the fluorescent lights suddenly sounded like a blaring siren ringing in my ears. He was running a background trace. A bored IT guy with a massive caffeine habit was blindly stumbling toward a $5 million landmine, dragging his feet right through my carefully constructed minefield. "I had my identity stolen a few years ago," I lied without missing a beat. The lie was incredibly smooth. I had practiced it in the mirror 100 times for a moment exactly like this. But my heart was hammering so violently against my ribs that I felt physically sick. It was a massive nightmare. Wiped out my credit, ruined my public records. I paid a private company to completely scrub my digital footprint. I prefer it this way. "Oh man, that sucks," Mark said, his mild curiosity entirely satisfied by the mundane administrative excuse. "Well, I'll just leave your profile blank for now. See ya." He strolled away, his lanyard jingling softly. I sat perfectly still in my rolling chair for 10 agonizing seconds, unable to blink. Then I stood up on shaky legs, walked directly to the women's restroom, locked myself in the far handicap stall, and violently threw up my morning coffee into the toilet. I slumped onto the floor, leaning my forehead against the cold, sterile tile wall, shaking uncontrollably. A ghost. They were actively looking at my records. If Gregson asked for a deeper audit, or if Mark pushed the corporate directory trace just a little further out of sheer boredom, the fragile false floor I had built would completely collapse. I needed an anchor. I desperately needed to be somewhere else, someone else entirely. I pulled my phone out of my pocket, my trembling thumb hovering desperately over Silas's contact name. I was practically begging the universe for a distraction, for a safe place to hide, completely unaware that the man I was praying to was already standing inside my house.
Chapter 10. The Intrusion. Silas. The deadbolt on Clara's apartment door was an absolute joke. It was a cheap, mass-produced brass fixture that offered the illusion of safety and nothing more. I stood in the quiet, faintly damp-smelling carpeted hallway of her building. The digital clock on my phone read exactly 11:15 a.m. on a Tuesday. The building was completely silent, the other tenants all swallowed by the city's massive corporate grid. Elena had casually mentioned at the bar that Clara was locked into a brutal, 4-hour quarterly reconciliation meeting today. I knew her exact schedule. I had all the time in the world. I slid a thin, flat steel tension wrench into the bottom of the keyhole, followed smoothly by a standard pick. 2 seconds of gentle, calculated pressure, a heavy metallic click, and the door swung open. I stepped inside, carefully closing and locking the door behind me so the deadbolt clicked back into place. The apartment smelled intensely of cheap vanilla candles and stale anxiety. I didn't move right away. I stood motionless in the narrow entryway and let my eyes adjust to the dim, grayish light filtering through the flimsy window curtains. I wasn't here to steal her electronics, and I certainly wasn't here to leave a sloppy calling card. I was an architect. I was here to measure the foundation before I started tearing out the walls. I walked slowly into the living room, my heavy boots intentionally making absolutely no sound on the cheap laminate flooring. I noted the wobbly IKEA coffee table. I noted the massive, disorganized stack of true crime paperbacks leaning heavily on the bookshelf. The irony was almost poetic. She was spending her evenings reading about predators, desperately trying to understand how the wolves operated, completely missing the fact that one was currently standing in the center of her living room. I moved down the short hall to the bedroom. It was impeccably clean. The bed was made with a tight, military precision. It was a textbook psychological tell. People who lived in a state of internal chaos often tried to aggressively control the smallest, most insignificant details of their physical environment to compensate. I opened her sliding closet door. I didn't touch her clothes. I immediately looked down at the floor. Tucked all the way in the back corner, intentionally hidden beneath a haphazard pile of old, empty shoeboxes, was a heavy canvas duffel bag. I crouched down, the leather of my jacket creaking slightly in the quiet room, and unzipped it. Inside were 3 changes of practical, dark clothing, a spare phone charger, a heavy-duty flashlight, and a thick, unmarked manila envelope. I pulled the envelope out and opened the metal clasp. It was packed tightly with banded stacks of crisp $100 bills, at least $20,000 in pure, untraceable currency. I stared down at the money, a slow, dark sense of immense satisfaction settling deep in my chest. A go bag. She wasn't just an anxious, fragile transplant hiding behind a loud friend. She was an active flight risk. She was running from something massive. I carefully placed the envelope back inside and zipped the bag, sliding it perfectly beneath the shoeboxes exactly as I had found it. I stood up, walking over to the small, tidy desk in the corner of her room. I rifled methodically through her small trash can, retrieving a crumpled, torn envelope from a local commercial bank. I flattened it out against the desk, quickly memorizing the routing numbers and the account details. If Clara had a secret that required $20,000 in cash shoved under the bed, it meant she had a massive weakness. It was a structural flaw I could exploit perfectly. With her bank routing numbers and a few hours behind my encrypted terminal at home, I could completely gut her history. I could find out exactly what she was so terrified of, and then I could engineer a scenario where I became the only man on Earth who could protect her from it. I left the apartment exactly as I had found it, locking the cheap deadbolt behind me. When the door clicked shut, the trap wasn't just set. It was inescapable.
Chapter 11. The Leash. Clara. The Italian place in the West End didn't have a sign, a neon window display, or even a recognizable awning. It was just a heavy, unmarked oak door wedged tightly between a 24-hour dry cleaner and a permanently closed bodega with iron bars over its windows. If you didn't know exactly what you were looking for, you would walk right past it. I liked that. For the first time all week, walking into a windowless room didn't make me feel trapped. It made me feel brilliantly hidden. Inside, the air was suffocatingly thick, heavy with the mouth-watering smell of crushed garlic, roasting meat, and expensive dark wine. The lighting was impossibly dim, cast entirely by small, flickering candles and heavy amber glass sitting at the center of each table. The patrons spoke in hushed, intimate murmurs that blended into a low, soothing hum. We sat in a curved, high-backed leather booth in the far back corner. The heavy leather swallowed the ambient noise of the restaurant, creating a private, insulated bubble around us. Silas had ordered for us the moment we sat down. A heavy, decanted Barolo and 2 plates of veal, without even glancing at a menu or asking what I wanted. I didn't mind. Actually, the utter lack of decision-making was a massive relief. I spent my entire life obsessively calculating risks, weighing every single action to make sure I didn't leave a footprint. Having a man simply take the wheel and dictate the evening felt less like losing control, and more like finally being allowed to drop a heavy, exhausting weight. I was too busy trying to keep my hands from visibly shaking to look at the menu anyway. The sheer terror of Mark's IT background check had been buzzing under my skin all day like a live wire. I took a long, desperate sip of the Barolo. It was incredibly dry, leaving a warm, velvet heat in the back of my throat. I set the crystal glass down and launched into a rambling, breathless story about the agonizing boredom of my accounting department. I was desperately overcompensating, trying to sound interesting, trying to prove that I belonged sitting across from a man wearing a bespoke charcoal suit who looked perfectly, effortlessly at ease in the shadows. I was mid-sentence when my phone vibrated violently against the dark wood of the table. The screen immediately lit up, the harsh, artificial white light glaringly bright and incredibly obnoxious in the dim, romantic restaurant. Elena, where are you? Elena, did you meet up with that guy again? Call me. I felt a sharp, hot flush of profound embarrassment crawl rapidly up my neck and burn my cheeks. The spell was instantly broken. I wasn't a sophisticated woman having a private dinner. I was a teenager who had missed curfew. I reached out quickly and flipped the phone face down, pushing it aggressively closer to my water glass to hide it. Sorry, I mumbled, hastily picking up my heavy silver fork and staring down at my plate. Silas didn't say anything right away. He didn't rush to fill the uncomfortable silence. He simply took a slow, measured sip of his wine, his amber eyes flicking from the overturned piece of plastic on the table back up to my flushed face. He looked mildly amused, but mostly just exhausted on my behalf. Is there an emergency? He asked, setting his glass down with a soft clink. His voice was a low, soothing rumble over the restaurant noise. No, I said quickly, my face still burning. It's just Elena. She gets anxious if I don't check in with her. Check in, Silas repeated. He didn't say it meanly. He didn't raise his voice or sound accusatory. He said it the way someone might repeat a strange, archaic foreign phrase they had never heard before. Like a curfew. She just worries, I defended weakly, my grip tightening on my fork. I suddenly felt incredibly, pathetically stupid. I was a 29-year-old woman sitting in a 3-star restaurant, and my friend was blowing up my phone like a frantic mother trying to track a toddler. Silas gracefully cut a piece of his veal, his movements precise and unhurried. It's nice that she cares about you, Clara. Really it is. But it must be incredibly exhausting for you, having to constantly manage and placate her anxiety on top of trying to live your own life. I stopped chewing. I swallowed hard, the heavy wine suddenly sitting like lead in my stomach. Managing her anxiety. That was exactly what it felt like. For 3 years, I had let Elena steer me through the city, order my drinks, and dictate my weekends because it was easier to hide in her shadow. But right now, the shadow just felt like a cage. I don't think she realizes she does it, Silas continued casually. He wasn't even looking at me. His focus was entirely on his meal, offering his devastating analysis with the casual detachment of a weather report. When people get used to you being vulnerable, they don't like it when you start standing on your own. It makes them feel obsolete. They lose their purpose. So they pull on the leash just to make sure you're still attached to their wrist. He didn't yell. He didn't demand I stop talking to her. He didn't give me an ultimatum. He just laid out a deeply uncomfortable, undeniable truth and left it sitting right there on the dark wood between us. I stared at my overturned phone. The phantom vibration I had been desperately begging for just yesterday was entirely gone, replaced by a suffocating, heavy irritation. I wasn't a runaway tonight. I was sitting across from a man who actively saw my potential, who treated me like an equal, and Elena was treating me like an uncontrollable flight risk. The phone vibrated again, a long, harsh buzz against the wood. Silas paused, his fork stopping halfway to his mouth. He raised one dark eyebrow, a silent, mildly questioning look that made my skin absolutely crawl with humiliation. I dropped my fork. I grabbed the phone. My thumbs hit the glass screen with sharp, angry taps. I am out. Stop checking up on me. I'll talk to you later. I hit send. I didn't wait for the inevitable, frantic reply. I pressed my thumb against the side of the casing, holding the power button down for 3 agonizing seconds until the screen went entirely black. The phone died in my hand. I dropped it into the bottomless depths of my canvas purse and violently yanked the zipper shut. When I looked back up, Silas was smiling. It was a small, devastatingly warm smile that made my chest physically ache. It was a look of pure, unadulterated pride. He reached across the small table, his large, warm fingers lightly brushing across my tense knuckles. Good, he said softly, his amber eyes completely locked onto mine. Now, tell me the rest of that story. I took a deep, shuddering breath. The dark, heavy resentment toward Elena instantly faded into the background, completely washed away by the sudden, intoxicating rush of Silas's absolute approval. I picked my fork back up, my hands entirely steady. As I launched back into my story, I felt completely, undeniably in control of my own life, completely blind to the fact that I had just eagerly handed him the leash. Chapter 12. The Intruder. Clara. The morning light filtering through my cheap bedroom blinds was a harsh, unforgiving, and completely joyless gray. The city outside was already awake, humming with the distant, muffled sounds of traffic and sirens. But inside my apartment, the air was heavy and perfectly still. I woke up slowly, dragging myself out of a deep, dreamless sleep. My body felt incredibly heavy, my muscles aching with a dull, unfamiliar soreness that I hadn't felt in years. I turned my head on the pillow, the cotton rustling loudly in the quiet room. Silas was already awake. He was standing near my cheap particle board dresser, his back to me. He was quietly buttoning a crisp white dress shirt. My stomach did a complicated, sudden flip. Last night had been a rapid, overwhelming blur. The heavy Barolo at the restaurant, the freezing, silent taxi ride back to my place, and a desperate, frantic collision the absolute second my front door had closed behind us. He had consumed all the oxygen in the room, and I had eagerly let him. I pulled the thick comforter up to my chin, watching the steady, competent way his hands moved over the small pearl buttons of his cuffs. He didn't look disheveled. He didn't look like a man who had just spent the night in a stranger's cramped apartment. He looked like he completely owned the room. Before I could even clear my throat to say good morning, the sharp, unmistakable sound of metal violently scraping against metal echoed from the front hallway. I froze instantly, my blood running ice cold. My first immediate thought was the audit. They found me. The police are at the door. The heavy deadbolt clicked loudly.
Clara?
A voice called out. It wasn't the police. It was sharp, panicked, and entirely familiar. The front door swung open, hitting the drywall of the entryway with a dull, heavy thud. Frantic footsteps hurried down the short hallway, the soles of wet boots squeaking against the laminate flooring.
Clara, are you here?
It was Elena. I sat bolt upright, clutching the blanket defensively to my chest. What the hell? I hissed under my breath, my heart hammering against my ribs. I had given Elena a spare brass key 2 years ago, explicitly for emergencies, like watering my plants if I was out of town or a fire. Not for a Wednesday morning wellness check. I looked over at Silas, terrified he would be furious about the intrusion. He didn't flinch. He didn't scramble to hide. He didn't look embarrassed, and he didn't tense up. He simply finished sliding a silver cufflink into place and turned toward the bedroom doorway with mild, almost clinical curiosity, just as Elena practically burst into the room. Elena stopped dead in her tracks, her eyes wide. She was wearing her clothes from yesterday, her raincoat dripping water onto my rug, her hair tied up in a messy, chaotic knot. She looked entirely manic. Her gaze snapped aggressively from me sitting in the bed to Silas standing calmly by the dresser.
Oh my God.
Elena breathed, her face completely draining of color as she took in the scene.
I've been calling you since last night. Your phone was completely off. I thought something terrible happened to you.
The lingering terror from the lock turning was instantly completely swallowed by a sickening mixture of white-hot rage and profound embarrassment. You let yourself into my apartment? I demanded, my voice shrill and tight.
You went completely dark.
Elena shot back, stepping further into my bedroom. Her manufactured anxiety immediately curdled into a loud, overbearing defensiveness. She pointed a shaking finger directly at Silas.
You told me to stop checking on you, and then you just vanish into the city with him. Do you have any idea how incredibly reckless that is, Clara?
Silas sighed. It wasn't an angry sound. It wasn't a defensive posture. It was the heavy, profoundly patient sigh of a sophisticated adult dealing with a screaming toddler in the middle of a grocery store. He picked up his tailored suit jacket from the back of my desk chair, smoothing the lapel.
Clara,
He said mildly. He completely ignored Elena's presence, addressing me as if my friend were entirely invisible.
does she usually just walk in uninvited?
No, I snapped, my face burning so hot I felt like I was running a fever.
I have a key because I'm the only one who actually looks out for you in this city.
Elena yelled, her voice cracking with dramatic, desperate betrayal. She looked at me, throwing her hands up.
Clara, look at yourself. Look at what you're doing. You're pushing me away for a guy you met 4 days ago. He's deliberately isolating you. Can't you see that?
I looked at Silas. He wasn't threatened by Elena's accusations. He wasn't trying to defend his character. He was simply waiting, perfectly still for me to handle the chaotic mess standing on my bedroom floor. He looked so incredibly stable, so perfectly rational compared to Elena, who was standing in my private sanctuary screaming about absolutely nothing. Give me the key, Elena, I said. My voice was physically shaking from the adrenaline, but the tone was ice cold. Elena stared at me as if I had just slapped her across the face.
What?
Give me the key, I repeated. I threw the heavy comforter off and stood up. I was wearing one of Silas's oversized t-shirts, my bare feet slapping softly against the cold hardwood as I marched directly over to her. I wasn't bracing for an impact anymore. I was initiating one. You are completely out of your mind, I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. I went on a date. I turned my phone off. I am 29 years old, Elena, and I do not need you breaking into my home to make sure I'm still breathing. Tears welled up instantly in Elena's eyes, a brilliant final act of manipulation. She reached into her damp coat pocket, her hand trembling violently, and pulled out the spare brass key. She dropped it directly onto the top of my dresser. It landed with a sharp, piercing clatter against the wood. She looked at Silas one last time. He didn't smirk. He didn't gloat. He just stared back at her with a complete indifferent blankness.
Fine.
Elena whispered, her voice totally hollow, playing the wounded victim to absolute perfection. She looked back at me.
Don't call me when this blows up.
She turned and walked out of the bedroom. A few seconds later, the front door slammed shut with enough force to rattle the cheap picture frames hanging on the hallway wall. The silence that instantly rushed back into the apartment was absolutely deafening. I stood in the middle of the room, my chest heaving, the adrenaline slowly crashing out of my system. I stared at the brass key resting on the dresser. I had just brutally cut off the only real friend I had in the city. I felt a sudden, terrifying wave of vertigo wash over me, the realization of my total isolation threatening to pull me under. Silas stepped up close behind me. He didn't say, "I told you so." He didn't wrap me in a dramatic, sweeping hug or offer empty apologies for the fight. He just placed one warm, heavy hand squarely on the back of my neck, right in the exact spot he had held me on the freezing roof 2 nights ago.
You handled that perfectly.
He murmured, his thumb brushing slowly, possessively against my skin.
Go take a hot shower. I'll make the coffee.
I closed my eyes, leaning backward, letting my entire weight fall against the solid, immovable wall of his chest. The vertigo completely faded. I wasn't alone. I had cut the only lifeline I had left, but as his hand squeezed my neck, I felt nothing but an overwhelming, devastating sense of safety. Chapter 13. The Golden Hour. Clara. The residual adrenaline from the screaming match with Elena had finally burned completely out of my system, leaving behind a hollow, trembling exhaustion. We left the suffocating quiet of my apartment and walked out into the biting afternoon air. The sky above the towering concrete skyline was a bruised, heavy purple, bloated and dark with an impending storm. The wind whipping down the concrete canyon of the street was vicious, carrying the metallic ozone scent of a hard freeze. I shivered violently the second the automatic glass doors of the lobby closed behind us. Silas didn't ask if I was cold. He didn't offer me his jacket or make a dramatic show of chivalry. He simply reached out, his large, warm hand wrapping firmly around my freezing fingers, and tucked my hand directly inside the deep, fleece-lined pocket of his heavy wool coat. I walked as close to his side as physically possible, letting him completely dictate our pace. I had spent the last 3 years navigating this city like a hunted animal, keeping my head bowed, bracing my shoulders for an impact, and scurrying frantically from one safe zone to the next. But walking next to Silas was an entirely different experience. He didn't yield to the crowded sidewalk. He walked with a slow, heavy, predatory confidence, and the oncoming crush of rushed commuters subconsciously parted to give him a wide berth. The city around us was a chaotic, deafening roar of gridlocked traffic and aggressive pedestrians, but I felt entirely shielded. More importantly, I was completely shielded from the frantic, spiraling noise of my own mind. Earlier today, I had severed my only lifeline. I had looked Elena in the eye, demanded my key back, and watched my only friend in the world walk out the door. Logically, I knew I should have been terrified. I should have been spiraling into a massive panic attack over being utterly alone in a city that actively wanted to swallow me whole. But with my hand securely anchored in Silas's pocket, feeling the steady, rhythmic cadence of his breathing through the thick wool of his coat, I didn't feel any panic at all. I just felt quiet. The heavy, exhausting burden of constantly worrying about Elena's judgment was gone. Silas had effectively cleared the board, leaving only the two of us. As we reached the exposed, open edge of the botanical gardens, the bruised clouds finally broke. It wasn't a gradual, warning drizzle. The sky simply ripped open, unleashing a sudden, violent, torrential downpour. I gasped, instinctively shrinking inward and throwing my free arm up to shield my face from the freezing, needle-like drops. Around us, the sidewalk instantly erupted into pure chaos. People shouted, newspapers were hastily thrown over heads, and dozens of pedestrians broke into a panicked sprint toward the meager shelter of a nearby glass bus stop. Silas didn't even break stride. He didn't flinch as the freezing water hit his hair, and he certainly didn't run. He moved with a terrifying, calm, deliberate precision. He stepped up directly behind me, pulling a large, heavy-duty black umbrella from the leather messenger bag slung across his chest, a bag I hadn't even consciously registered he was carrying until this exact second. I happened to be in the area and figured the weather looked like it might turn. He lied smoothly, his voice dropping to a low, soothing hum over the deafening roar of the rain hitting the pavement. It was a completely ridiculous statement. The morning forecast had called for clear, dry skies all week. But I didn't care. I didn't care if he had checked the radar obsessively, or if he just carried an umbrella like a weapon waiting to be deployed. I just cared that he was ready. He snapped the canopy open. It was massive, a sprawling dome of taut, heavy black fabric that instantly cut off the freezing wind. It was so impossibly wide that not a single drop of rain touched my shoulders. We walked 4 long blocks in the middle of the torrential downpour. Silas's arm was tucked firmly, possessively around my waist, pulling my side flush against his ribs. His body created a perfect, impenetrable, dry bubble in the very center of the storm. The sound of the rain hammering against the taut nylon above us was deafening, entirely drowning out the noise of the city, effectively isolating us in our own private moving room. I watched the frantic city through the curtain of water pouring off the edge of the umbrella. The world outside the canopy was miserable, soaked to the bone, and fighting a losing battle against the elements. But inside the bubble, there was only the smell of expensive wool, the faint, comforting trace of cedar aftershave, and absolute radiating warmth. When we finally reached the arched, illuminated entrance of the train station, he stopped. He didn't pull his arm away to let me go. He leaned down and pressed a slow, firm kiss against my forehead. "I just didn't want you to be uncomfortable," he whispered, his breath warm against my damp skin. The words sank directly into my bloodstream, a lethal, perfect injection of validation. I felt a complete, intoxicating, and total surrender wash over my exhausted body. I looked up into his amber eyes, the noise of the crowded station entirely fading away. I didn't want to be independent anymore. I didn't want to advocate for myself, or fight the current, or pretend I was strong enough to survive out in the freezing rain on my own. I wanted to hand him the reins. I wanted to be sheltered. Chapter 14, The Disconnect. Clara. The transition didn't happen gradually. 2 weeks after the screaming match with Elena, Silas simply walked into my bedroom on a Friday evening, dropped an empty canvas duffel bag onto the mattress, and told me to pack. "You need to disconnect," he said, pulling my heavy winter boots out of the closet and setting them by the door. His tone brooked absolutely no argument. No spreadsheets, no frantic city noise, no checking over your shoulder. Just a weekend to actually breathe. I didn't argue. I packed the bag. We drove for 3 hours in his heavy black truck, leaving the rigid, suffocating concrete grid of the city entirely behind as the highway wound up into the heavily wooded mountainous hills. The drive was mostly silent. The aggressive, vibrating rumble of the truck's custom exhaust was a constant, heavy drone that practically vibrated my teeth. I rested my forehead against the cold passenger window, watching the street lamps and neon signs slowly give way to an endless, impenetrable wall of dark pines. The cabin was a stark, steeply pitched A-frame structure tucked into a precarious incline at the end of a long, unmarked dirt road. It was surrounded on all sides by a dense, dripping canopy of ancient evergreens that blocked out the moonlight almost entirely. As Silas finally cut the engine, the aggressive rumble of the exhaust dying away into nothing, the sudden silence of the woods was absolute. It was heavy, thick, and deeply unnatural to my city-acclimated ears. I instinctively reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my phone. The screen lit up the dark cab of the truck. No service. A sharp, instantaneous spike of pure panic hit my chest. My thumb hovered desperately over the top right corner of the screen, praying for a single, elusive bar of signal to appear. What if something happened out here? What if the truck wouldn't start tomorrow? What if I desperately needed to call someone? I stared at the empty signal bars, my breathing growing rapid and shallow. And then, the cold, miserable reality washed over me. I had absolutely no one left to call anyway. Elena was gone. I had cut the cord myself. I had demanded my key back, and she had walked away. The only person in the entire world who knew exactly where I was right now was sitting in the driver's seat next to me. Silas reached over the wide center console. His large, warm hand completely covered the glowing screen of my phone, pushing it gently downward until it rested on my thigh. "You're safe here," he said softly. The absolute, unshakable certainty in his amber eyes pinned me in place. The panic slowly receded, replaced by a heavy narcotic submission. I locked the screen and dropped the dead piece of plastic back into my pocket. The weekend became a terrifyingly effective masterclass in hyper-focused attention. With the rest of the world entirely stripped away, Silas's gaze was a physical weight I carried constantly. On Saturday afternoon, we hiked a steep, muddy trail that cut directly up the jagged ridge behind the A-frame. The air was incredibly thin up here, biting at my lungs, and it smelled intensely of wet earth, decomposing pine needles and ozone. I was exhausted, my thighs burning with every step. But I pushed myself relentlessly to keep up with his long, effortless strides. I wanted to prove I wasn't just a fragile city girl. I wanted his approval. Near the rocky summit, the incline became treacherous. My heavy boot caught the edge of a slick, rain-washed patch of gray shale. There was no warning. My feet flew violently out from under me. For a terrifying fraction of a second, the world tilted sickeningly. I felt the horrifying sensation of zero gravity, the jagged rocks rushing up to meet my skull. Before I could even draw breath to scream, Silas lunged. His reflexes were inhumanly fast. His massive hand clamped down around my bicep like a steel vise, jerking my entire body weight violently upward and backward with a brutal, sudden force. My shoulder popped incredibly loudly in its socket, a sickening, wet snap that echoed off the trees. "I've got you," he said. His grip was actively bruising the tender flesh of my arm right through the thick nylon of my winter jacket. I gasped, my heart hammering a frantic, painful rhythm against my ribs, entirely drowning out the wind. The pain in my shoulder was blinding, a hot, searing tear of muscle and tendon, but I completely ignored it. "Thank you," I breathed, my hands clutching desperately at the heavy wool of his sweater. He hadn't just stopped me from falling. He had yanked me back from the edge with a physical strength that was both completely terrifying and deeply, profoundly comforting. I belonged to him now. He had physically overpowered gravity to keep me. That night, the temperature outside plummeted well below freezing. A massive fire roared in the cabin's stone hearth, casting long, violent, flickering shadows against the raw timber walls. The heat was intense, baking the moisture out of the air. Silas draped a heavy, rough-spun wool blanket tightly over my shoulders, pulling me backward until I was sitting directly between his legs on the braided rug, my back pressed flush against his broad chest. He rested his chin lightly on the top of my head, staring blankly into the hypnotic orange flames. "I spend my entire life making sure old, gutted structures don't collapse," he said. His voice dropped to a low, raw rumble that vibrated powerfully against my spine. "I reinforce the rot. I build things that are meant to last for centuries, but I never had anything of my own. I never found a foundation I actually wanted to build on. Until now." The words hit me right in the center of my chest, a devastating, perfectly aimed strike. I felt a hot, humiliating tear slip down my cheek. I was completely, utterly overwhelmed by the absolute, grounding devotion in his voice. I turned my face into the rough wool of his sweater, inhaling the sharp scent of cedar and wood smoke filling my lungs. The safety he projected in this dark, isolated cabin was so absolute, so suffocatingly thick, that the very last of my defensive walls simply snapped and crumbled into dust. I started talking. I didn't mention the exact sum of $5 million, and I didn't utter a word about the offshore accounts. But I talked about Pennsylvania. I poured out the suffocating, crushing guilt of the massive, life-altering mistakes I had made. I described the exhausting, paralyzing terror of constantly looking over my shoulder, waiting for the authorities to finally knock on my door and drag me away. Silas didn't interrupt. He didn't judge me. He didn't pull away, and he didn't ask for the incriminating specifics. He just held me tighter against his chest, his large fingers gently, rhythmically stroking the hair at the base of my neck. He sat in the warm firelight and patiently absorbed every single vulnerability I eagerly handed him, silently and meticulously filing each one away in the dark. Chapter 15. The Sanctuary, Clara. Sunday mornings used to be a battleground. Before Silas, my Sundays were a hollow, exhausting countdown to Monday. I would wake up with a heavy pit of dread in my stomach, the frantic mental math of my own survival consuming every hour. I would sit on my cheap sofa and stare blankly at the wall, running through endless, terrifying scenarios of an auditor knocking on my door or a federal agent waiting by my desk. My weekends were just a brief, agonizing pause in the hunt. Now, Sundays were a fortress. I woke up late. The heavy, expensive down comforter pulled all the way up to my chin. The space beside me in bed was already empty, the sheets cool to the touch, but the apartment smelled heavily of roasting dark roast coffee and the rich, nutty scent of browned butter. It was a curated, manufactured warmth that actively pushed back the freezing gray reality of the city winter outside the window. I slipped out of bed, shivering slightly as my bare feet hit the floor, and pulled one of Silas's oversized t-shirts over my head. The thick white cotton swallowed my frame entirely. It fell to mid-thigh, smelling faintly of cedar and his expensive, sharp aftershave. Wearing his clothes felt like putting on a heavy layer of armor. It was a physical, constant reminder that I belonged to him. I walked quietly out into the living room, actively avoiding the specific spots on the hardwood that I knew creaked. I didn't want to disturb the profound peace of the morning. Silas was sitting cross-legged on the floor in the center of the plush rug. He had pushed my wobbly, scuffed IKEA coffee table onto its side and was surrounded by a scattered, organized pile of brasswood screws and a small tube of industrial adhesive. He was wearing gray sweatpants and a plain white t-shirt, his dark hair slightly mussed. He looked completely, effortlessly at ease. He didn't look up right away as I leaned against the doorframe. He was focused entirely on meticulously realigning one of the cheap particle board legs. The joints were loose, he said, sensing me standing there. His voice was a low, soothing rumble that vibrated through the quiet room. Every time you set your mug down, it rattled. It was driving me crazy. I watched him work. The visual was incredibly jarring. Any other man in his tax bracket, a man who designed commercial high-rises and wore bespoke wool coats, would have simply thrown the flimsy $20 table into the dumpster and bought something massive and expensive to replace it. Silas wasn't doing that. He had gone out to the hardware store early on a freezing Sunday morning just to carefully rebuild the cheap, broken thing I already owned. "You didn't have to do that," I murmured, walking over and sitting cross-legged on the floor next to him. "I wanted to," he said smoothly, not missing a single beat. He took a brass screw from the pile and drove it seamlessly into the newly glued joint. The muscles in his forearm flexed with the effortless, practiced turn of the screwdriver. "Pass me that cloth?" I handed him a damp rag from the floor. I watched his hands, the exact same strong, calloused, terrifying hands that had bruised my bicep to the bone on the hiking trail. The same hands that possessed the physical strength to crush my windpipe. Now carefully, gently wiping away a microscopic bead of excess wood glue from the cheap veneer. He stopped, wiping his hands on the cloth, and reached into a small black velvet pouch sitting beside his open toolbox. "I also found this while I was at the shop," he said. He handed me the small, hand-painted ceramic bowl I had kept since college. It used to sit on my kitchen counter, holding loose change and old receipts. It had a jagged, ugly chip missing from the rim, a permanent scar from where I had dropped it during my frantic, terrified move from Pennsylvania 3 years ago. I had kept it because it reminded me of exactly how easily my life could shatter. But now, the broken edge was completely gone. The missing chunk of ceramic had been meticulously filled with a bright, gold-tinted epoxy, built up to perfectly match the original curve of the rim, and sanded down until it was completely smooth to the touch. "It has character," he said, looking up at me. His amber eyes were filled with an expression of pure, wounded adoration. There's an old art of repairing broken pottery with lacquer mixed with powdered gold. The philosophy is that the breakage and the repair are part of the history of the object, rather than something to disguise. He reached out, his thumb lightly tracing the golden seam he had built into the bowl. It's part of your history, Clara, and that's why it's worth keeping. I don't want to throw your pieces away. I just want to fix them so they can hold their shape. I stared down at the golden seam. A massive, heavy wave of pure emotion hit my chest, swelling up into my throat until I could barely draw breath. A hot tear slipped down my cheek and splashed heavily onto my wrist. For 3 agonizing years, I had felt entirely broken, entirely disposable. I had felt like a pathetic fugitive wearing a disguise that was constantly slipping. And here was a man who looked directly at my ruined edges, at my paranoia and my flaws, and decided to fill them with gold. "You're incredible," I whispered, my voice breaking completely. I set the bowl down and reached out, my fingers trembling as I traced the hard, rough line of his jaw. He smiled, leaning in to kiss me softly. He tasted like dark espresso and absolute safety. I closed my eyes, leaning my entire weight against his broad shoulder, letting him wrap his arms tightly around me. I was completely, blissfully blind to the reality of what was actually happening. He wasn't fixing my wings. By filling in all my cracks with his own material, he was just ensuring I would never be able to break apart and escape. He was meticulously reinforcing the bars of the cage. Chapter 16, The Erasure, Clara. The erasure of my identity didn't happen in an explosive, screaming fight. It was a slow, methodical sanding down of my edges, perfectly and completely disguised as love. It started innocuously enough on a quiet Wednesday morning. I was standing in front of the bathroom mirror, the harsh fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. I uncapped my favorite red lipstick, a bright, bold cherry color that I used to wear on days when I desperately needed to feel bulletproof. I swiped it carefully across my lower lip, rubbing my lips together to set the heavy pigment. Silas appeared silently in the doorway. He didn't make a sound on the hardwood. He just leaned casually against the frame, holding a steaming mug of black coffee, watching me. I smiled at him in the mirror, pressing my lips together. "Too much for a Wednesday?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light and breezy. Silas stepped into the bathroom and set his mug softly on the edge of the sink. He stepped up directly behind me, his large, solid frame entirely blocking out the rest of the bathroom in the reflection of the glass. He reached out. He didn't ask me to take it off. He didn't tell me he disliked the color. He simply pressed his heavy thumb against the corner of my mouth and dragged it roughly, punishingly across my lips, smearing the expensive red pigment violently across my cheek. I froze. The breath completely vanished from my lungs. The gesture was casual, yet so entirely invasive, so quietly aggressive, that my brain couldn't decide whether to scream at him or apologize for wearing it. My heart began to hammer a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Silas picked up a damp washcloth from the counter. He gripped my chin firmly with one hand, holding my head perfectly still, and meticulously wiped the smeared red completely from my face. The terry cloth was rough and scratching painfully against my delicate skin. "You have such delicate features, Clara," he murmured. His eyes were focused entirely on his task, completely ignoring the sheer terror radiating off my rigid body. He picked up a muted, pale nude gloss that I had pushed to the back of my drawer months ago and handed the cheap plastic tube to me. "You don't need to scream for attention," he said softly. "This suits the real you." I looked at the pale tube in my hand, then up at his reflection. His amber eyes were warm, filled with that heavy, intoxicating devotion. He wasn't insulting me. He was editing me. And he was doing it with the terrifying certainty of a man who fully owned the canvas. "Okay," I whispered, my voice shaking. I applied the gloss. I looked washed out. I looked invisible. "Beautiful," Silas said. He kissed the top of my head and walked out of the bathroom, leaving me staring at a complete stranger in the mirror. By the end of the month, the cherry red lipstick was in the trash. My favorite morning true crime podcasts, the ones that fed my paranoia but kept me alert, were replaced by the low, sweeping cello sonatas Silas preferred to wake up to. When I tried to wear my favorite vintage floral dress to a dinner date, I found it missing from my closet. I donated a few bags to the shelter today. Silas told me casually when I frantically asked about it, not even looking up from his laptop screen. That heavy floral print was just clutter, Clara. It hid you. We're going to get you pieces that actually fit. I felt a sudden, sharp spike of absolute outrage. It was my dress, my closet, my choice. But before the angry words could leave my mouth, Silas looked up. He gave me that highly focused, adoring smile, the specific one that made me feel completely safe from the rest of the world. The anger immediately curdled into a sick, heavy guilt. He was taking care of me. He was clearing out the unnecessary noise from my life. He just wanted me to look my absolute best, and I was being ungrateful over a piece of cheap, outdated fabric. But the leash was getting tighter, and I was starting to physically feel the suffocating tension of it even when he wasn't in the room with me. The train ride home on Thursday evening was suffocating. The car was packed shoulder to shoulder with exhausted commuters shaking off wet umbrellas and staring blankly at the glowing screens of their phones. I sat crammed against the foggy, damp window, watching a girl sitting directly across the aisle. She was wearing a bright, chaotic neon jacket, laughing loudly into her phone, completely unbothered by the fact that she was taking up space. I looked down at my own lap. I was wearing a muted, charcoal gray wool coat. My hands were folded perfectly in my lap. I was sitting exactly the way Silas preferred. Spine completely straight, shoulders pulled back, projecting an elegant silhouette. I caught myself doing it and felt a sudden, sickening jolt right in the pit of my stomach. Click. It was like a massive, heavy switch flipping in my head. I was performing. Even here, miles away from the apartment, miles away from the crushing weight of his amber eyes, I was still actively acting like he was watching me. My hand drifted slowly to my purse. My fingers brushed the cold glass of my phone screen. I hadn't spoken to Elena in 5 weeks. I missed her chaotic, unfiltered energy. I missed the way she loudly complained about the terrible coffee at the office. I pulled the phone out, my thumb hovering desperately over her contact name. I just needed to hear a familiar voice that wasn't quietly evaluating me. But the exact moment my thumb twitched toward the green call button, Silas's voice echoed loudly in my head, as clear and commanding as if he were sitting in the empty plastic seat right beside me. Is she protecting you, Clara? Or is she just a leash? She keeps you small. My chest tightened painfully. If I called Elena, I was weak. If I called Elena, I was reverting back to the broken, frantic, terrified girl Silas had saved. I was actively betraying the perfect structure he was building for us. I locked the phone screen. The glass went completely black, reflecting my own pale, exhausted, invisible face back at me. I slid it back into my purse, folding my hands perfectly in my lap once again. The girl in the neon jacket kept laughing, and I stared out into the dark, rushing subway tunnel, feeling entirely, utterly alone. Chapter 17. The Punchline. Clara. The tension didn't snap all at once. It wasn't an explosive, violent event that gave me a clear reason to run. It was a slow, creeping chill that I didn't even realize was happening until I was already violently shivering. It was later that same Thursday evening. Outside, the freezing rain was drumming a steady, heavy, relentless beat against the thick glass of the living room windows. Inside, the apartment felt impossibly cozy and entirely sealed off from the rest of the world. Silas was sitting at the granite kitchen island, typing quietly and methodically on his laptop, and I was curled up comfortably on the plush leather sofa with a paperback. It was a contemporary drama I had picked up on a whim at a dusty used bookstore near the office. It wasn't high art, and it certainly wasn't educational, but the characters felt messy, flawed, and incredibly real, and I had been looking forward to finishing it all day. It was a story about people making massive, chaotic mistakes and finding a way to survive them, and reading it felt like a tiny, secret rebellion against the sterile perfection of the apartment. Across the room, Silas closed his laptop. The sharp, metallic click made me look up instantly, my attention automatically snapping to him. He walked over and dropped casually onto the sofa next to me, his arm sliding naturally and possessively along the back of the leather cushions. He leaned in, his broad shoulder pressing firmly against mine, and glanced down at the open pages resting in my lap. "What has you so captivated?" he asked, his voice low, warm, and easy. "Just a novel," I said, holding it up slightly so he could see the brightly colored cover. "A coworker recommended it. It's actually really gripping." Silas took the book from my hands. He didn't snatch it aggressively, but the movement was fluid and entirely presumptuous, an unspoken assertion that whatever I was holding was subject to his immediate review. He flipped to the back cover, his amber eyes scanning the summary paragraphs rapidly. A small, mildly amused smile touched the corners of his mouth. He flipped the book back open and read a line of the dialogue out loud. His tone was perfectly flat, completely draining the emotion and context out of the words, making the sentence sound entirely ridiculous and pathetically melodramatic. He chuckled, tossing the book onto the heavy antique coffee table. It landed with a loud, heavy smack that echoed in the quiet room. "Mental junk food," he said, shaking his head with a look of mild, sophisticated pity. "I don't know how you can stomach that kind of manufactured garbage, Clara. It's like reading a soap opera." A hot, sudden prickle of profound embarrassment flared deep in my chest, immediately followed by a sharp, defensive spark of anger. I was exhausted, and I just wanted to read my book in peace. "It's not garbage," I said, sitting up a little straighter, pulling my shoulder away from his. "It's just a story about people dealing with their mistakes. I like it. It helps me unwind." Silas's smile didn't vanish, but the intoxicating warmth behind his amber eyes instantly evaporated. The shift in his expression was microscopic, but the temperature in the room plummeted so violently I actually felt cold. He slowly pulled his arm back from the sofa cushions, creating a distinct, deliberate physical gap between us. "I was just making an observation, Clara," he said. His voice was perfectly calm, perfectly level, and completely devoid of the sharp, defensive edge I had just used. "There's no need to snap at me." "I'm not snapping," I argued, though my heart was suddenly beating faster, my pulse thrumming anxiously in my throat. "You just insulted a book I'm really enjoying. You made me feel stupid for reading it." Silas let out a heavy, profoundly disappointed sigh. He dragged a hand slowly over his face, looking at me not with anger, but like I was a frustrating, irrational puzzle he was rapidly losing patience with. "I made a joke about a mass-market paperback," he corrected softly, his tone dripping with absolute reason. "I didn't call you stupid. But if you're so incredibly fragile that you tie your entire ego to a piece of cheap fiction, then maybe we need to evaluate why you're so aggressively defensive tonight." I opened my mouth to argue, but the words died instantly in my throat. I frantically replayed the last 30 seconds in my head, searching for my own footing. Had I snapped at him? He was just teasing. That was something normal couples did. They teased each other about their tastes. I was sitting here acting like he had just burned my house down over a cheap, meaningless novel. The fault wasn't his. The fault was my own broken, paranoid wiring. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Silas just sat there, making absolutely no move to bridge the gap, looking at me with that crushing, analytical disappointment. The cozy, insulated safety of the rainy evening was completely gone, replaced by a heavy tension that made it hard to draw a full breath. I hated it. I hated the agonizing physical space between us on the sofa. I wanted the warmth back. "You're right," I whispered, staring down at my empty hands. My stomach was tied in agonizing knots. "I'm sorry. I'm just tired from work. I didn't mean to overreact." Silas watched me for another long, agonizing second, letting me sit in the discomfort of my own apology. Then the tension broke. His face softened entirely. He reached out, his large hand sliding firmly behind my neck, pulling me across the physical gap on the sofa until I was tucked firmly against his solid chest. He kissed the top of my head, his fingers gently threading through my hair. "It's okay," he murmured, his breath warm and incredibly soothing against my temple. "I just want you to engage with things that challenge you, Clara. You're too smart to fill your head with noise. I just want the best for you." "I know," I breathed, wrapping my arms desperately around his waist. The relief was absolute. The drug was back in my system. I felt entirely safe again, completely shielded from the storm outside, actively grateful that he had forgiven me for a fight he had started. I left the paperback on the coffee table that night. The next morning, before I left for work, I quietly dropped it into the kitchen trash can. I never even read the last chapter. Chapter 18. The Thread, Clara. The apartment was always perfectly climate-controlled, but when Silas wasn't physically in it, the space felt completely devoid of oxygen. It was early Friday afternoon. Silas had been called away to physically inspect a commercial restoration site in the financial district. He had kissed my forehead, told me to order whatever I wanted for lunch, and locked the heavy deadbolt behind him. I had spent the last 3 hours sitting on the leather sofa, staring blankly at the glowing screen of my laptop, trying to focus on a massive quarterly spreadsheet for work. I was practically a remote employee now. Silas had casually suggested I start working from his apartment to avoid the exhausting city commute, and I had eagerly agreed. At 1:15 p.m., my laptop screen flickered aggressively and died. I groaned in frustration, tossing the dead machine onto the cushions. I had left my power cord at my own apartment, a place I hadn't stepped foot inside in over 2 weeks. I knew Silas kept an array of spare electronics and universal chargers in his home office down the hall. I hesitated. The office was the only room in the sprawling apartment that felt distinctly off-limits. He had never explicitly forbidden me from entering it, but the heavy oak door was always firmly shut, creating an unspoken, rigid boundary. My heart gave a tiny, nervous flutter at the thought of crossing it, a conditioned response to stepping out of the lines he had drawn for me. "It's just a charger," I told myself, feeling incredibly foolish. "You practically live here." I pushed myself off the sofa and walked down the quiet hallway. I turned the brass knob and pushed the heavy oak door open. The office smelled intensely of old paper, ozone from the high-end server tower humming in the corner, and the sharp bite of his cedar aftershave. The room was dominated by a massive antique mahogany desk that sat squarely in the center of the dark vintage rug. The walls were lined with meticulously organized bookshelves and rolled architectural blueprints. The space was imposing, sterile and entirely intimidating. I walked behind the heavy desk. The surface was completely clear, save for a sleek black desk lamp and a matching leather blotter. I reached for the top right drawer, pulling the brass handle. It was locked. I tried the left drawer, also locked. I sighed, dropping my hand down to the wide, flat-centered drawer directly above the chairwell. I pulled. It didn't slide open smoothly. It hitched slightly, catching on the internal locking mechanism. Silas hadn't pushed it entirely shut. He had been rushing this morning, distracted by an urgent phone call from a contractor, and he had made a microscopic, uncharacteristic error. He had left the master drawer unlatched. I pulled it open. There were no chargers inside. The drawer was almost entirely empty, except for a heavy, unmarked black leather portfolio resting squarely in the center. I stared at it. A sudden, deep chill washed over my arms, raising the fine hairs on my skin. Every single survival instinct I possessed, the exact same razor-sharp instincts that had kept me alive and hidden for 3 years after I fled Pennsylvania, suddenly screamed at me to close the drawer and walk away. My hand moved completely on its own. My fingers were shaking violently as I reached down, lifted the heavy leather flap, and flipped the portfolio open. The very first thing sitting on top of the stack of papers was a bank routing slip. It was torn, crumpled, and heavily stained with what looked like coffee grounds. I recognized the account number instantly. I recognized the tear in the paper. It was the exact slip I had thrown into my own bedroom trash can 3 weeks ago. The air rushed entirely out of my lungs in a single, painful gasp. The floor beneath my feet seemed to tilt sickeningly. Why does he have trash from my bedroom? My hands were trembling so badly the thick paper rattled as I moved the slip aside. Beneath it was a thick, meticulously organized dossier. There were printed spreadsheets detailing the massive, untraceable cash deposits I had made into the offshore accounts. There were printed copies of my fake IDs. He knew about the $5 million. He knew about the audit. He knew absolutely everything. But the financial records weren't the thing that finally broke me. It was the photographs. I flipped to the next page, pulling out a stack of glossy, high-resolution surveillance photos. The first was a picture of me and Elena sitting at the coffee shop in the West End. I was wearing the red lipstick he had wiped off my face. The second was a photo of me walking into my office building, my shoulders hunched against the wind. I flipped to the third photo, and my heart completely stopped beating. It was taken inside the converted warehouse gallery. It was a wide shot of the chaotic main floor. Elena was in the foreground, turning to walk away toward the jagged metal sculpture. And there, standing in the deep, unfocused background of the shot, leaning casually against a brick pillar and staring directly at the back of my head, was Silas. He was watching me before Elena ever left my side. The timeline completely shattered in my mind. He hadn't just happened to be standing in the quiet architectural exhibit looking for an escape from the noise. He had tracked me there. He had waited for Elena to leave, and then he had positioned himself perfectly in the alcove, playing the classical music, building a flawless, quiet trap for a panicked, skittish animal to walk directly into. The umbrella in the rain. The broken ceramic bowl repaired with gold. The argument with Elena that ended with me voluntarily throwing my only lifeline away. None of it was an accident. None of it was love. It was architecture. He had studied my structural flaws, and he had systematically isolated me, cut me off from the herd, and locked me in a vault that I had practically begged him to build. A wave of pure, violent nausea hit me so hard I had to grip the heavy edge of the mahogany desk just to keep my knees from buckling. I clapped my hand tightly over my mouth, suffocating a desperate, terrified sob. I am not safe. The thought echoed in my skull, deafening and absolute. I am living with a predator. I stared down at the surveillance photos, the terrifying reality of my situation crashing down on me in suffocating waves. If he realized I had opened this drawer, he wouldn't just be disappointed. He would know the illusion was broken. The psychological manipulation would end, and the physical captivity would immediately begin. I had to put it back. I forced my violently shaking hands to steady. I carefully realigned the glossy photos, ensuring the edges were perfectly flush. I placed the crumpled bank slip exactly where I had found it, closed the heavy leather flap, and slid the portfolio back into the center of the drawer. I pushed the drawer shut. It clicked heavily, the locking mechanism finally engaging, sealing the evidence away. I backed away from the desk, my breathing ragged and shallow, my chest heaving in the quiet, ozone-scented air. I had spent the last month letting him erase me, completely surrendering my control because I was so desperately tired of running. But as I turned and walked out of the home office, shutting the heavy oak door softly behind me, the exhaustion was entirely gone. The submissive, compliant girl Silas had meticulously sculpted out of my terror had just died. I wasn't going to wait for the cage to shrink any further. I had outrun federal auditors and private investigators, and now I was going to have to figure out how to outrun the architect. Chapter 19. The Vault. Clara. The air rushed entirely out of my lungs in a single, painful gasp. The floor beneath my feet seemed to tilt sickeningly as I stared down at the third glossy photograph. It was taken inside the converted warehouse gallery. Elena was in the foreground, turning to walk away toward the jagged metal sculpture. And there, standing in the deep, unfocused background of the shot, leaning casually against a brick pillar and staring directly at the back of my head, was Silas. He was watching me before Elena ever left my side. The timeline completely shattered in my mind. He hadn't just happened to be standing in the quiet architectural exhibit looking for an escape from the noise. He had tracked me there. He had positioned himself perfectly in the alcove, playing the classical music, building a flawless, quiet trap for a panicked, skittish animal to walk directly into. The umbrella in the rain, the broken ceramic bowl repaired with gold, the argument with Elena that ended with me voluntarily throwing my only lifeline away. None of it was an accident. None of it was love. You really couldn't just leave the drawer closed, could you? The voice was low, incredibly calm, and came from directly behind me. My blood turned to absolute ice. My lungs seized, the breath freezing painfully in my chest. The heavy, glossy photograph slipped from my violently trembling fingers, landing silently on the leather blotter. I didn't turn around right away. I couldn't. Every single survival instinct I possessed, the razor-sharp instincts that had kept me alive and hidden for 3 years, screamed at me to move, but my legs were completely paralyzed. I slowly turned my head, my heart hammering a frantic, agonizing rhythm against my ribs. Silas was leaning casually against the heavy oak frame of the office door. He wasn't wearing his tailored coat or his boots. He was wearing a dark, comfortable sweater, his arms crossed loosely over his broad chest. He didn't look angry. He didn't look like a man who had just been caught hiding a terrifying, obsessive secret. He looked profoundly, crushingly disappointed.
You were doing so well, Clara.
He said, pushing off the door frame and taking a slow, measured step into the room.
You were finally letting go. You were finally letting me build something stable for you. All you had to do was trust me enough not to look.
You stalked me, I whispered, my voice trembling so violently I could barely form the words. I pressed my back hard against the edge of the heavy mahogany desk, putting as much physical distance between us as the room allowed.
I evaluated you.
Silas corrected smoothly. He took another step forward. His sheer physical size seemed to suck all the remaining oxygen out of the room.
I saw a structural flaw that was going to collapse, and I decided to reinforce it. He gestured vaguely toward the open drawer, his amber eyes flat and completely devoid of the warm, intoxicating devotion that had kept me sedated for the past month. I know about the $5 million, he stated plainly, dropping the bomb with zero inflection. I know about the corporate audit in Pennsylvania. I know you've been living out of a canvas duffel bag for 3 years, jumping at shadows, waiting for the federal government to finally put you in a cage.
I flinched as if he had physically struck me.
I bought your debt, Clara.
He continued, his voice an unbroken, hypnotic rumble. He stopped just on the other side of the desk, resting his large hands flat on the polished wood.
I wiped the digital trail. I erased the footprint you left in the corporate directory. I built a perfect, impenetrable wall around you. Do you have any idea what it cost to make you invisible?
I never asked you to do that, I screamed, the terror finally cracking through my throat. You took pictures of me. You isolated me from my best friend. Silas tilted his head slightly, a dark, chilling smile touching the corner of his mouth.
Elena was a crutch. She was keeping you small, making you believe you were incapable of surviving the city without her holding your hand. I just removed the leash.
You didn't remove the leash, I shot back, tears of pure, hot panic finally spilling over my eyelashes. You just put it in your own hand.
Because I am the only one who can actually protect you,
he said, his voice dropping to a harsh, absolute whisper. He moved around the side of the desk with a terrifying, sudden speed. I tried to dart away, but his hand clamped down around my upper arm like a steel vise. The exact same brutal, bruising grip he had used on the hiking trail. He jerked me forward, pulling me flush against his solid chest. I gasped, my hands flying up to push frantically against his shoulders. But it was like trying to push a concrete pillar. He didn't budge. He raised his free hand, his large fingers tangling roughly in my hair, forcing my head up so I had absolutely no choice but to look directly into his eyes.
If you walk out that front door,
Silas murmured, his breath warm against my trembling lips.
You won't make it 3 blocks before the panic sets in. And even if you do, the auditors will find you within the week. I am the only thing standing between you and a federal prison cell.
He leaned down, pressing his forehead against mine. The physical proximity was suffocating.
I built a sanctuary for you, Clara. I filled in all your broken edges. You belong here now.
He let go of my hair, his hand sliding down to rest possessively against the back of my neck. He didn't wait for me to agree, and he didn't ask for my surrender. He just held me there in the suffocating quiet of the office, surrounded by the physical evidence of his total control, letting the absolute, terrifying reality of my captivity settle deep into my bones. Chapter 20. The Blind Spot. Clara.
I am the only safe place left.
Silas murmured, his thumbs slowly stroking the fabric of my jeans as he crouched in front of me.
I bought your debt. I own the cage the federal government wanted to put you in. As long as you stay right here, within the walls I built for you, you are entirely untouchable. I
Stared into his eyes, the terrifying reality of my situation finally crystallizing. He wasn't going to tie me to a chair. He didn't need to. He had built a psychological panopticon, giving me a choice between a concrete federal cell or a plush leather sofa with a locked oak door. Okay, I whispered. I forced my shoulders to drop, intentionally letting the rigid defensive tension completely drain out of my body. I made my eyes wide and entirely vacant. Okay, I'll stay. Silas's face softened instantly. The cold, clinical architect vanished, replaced immediately by the warm, adoring protector. He stood up, pulling me gently up with him, and wrapped his arms tightly around my exhausted body.
I'm going to make dinner.
He murmured into my hair, pressing a warm kiss to my temple. Why?
You just rest.
He let go and walked casually toward the kitchen, his broad back turned completely to me. He was arrogant. He believed his own flawless architecture. He believed he had broken me so completely that I wouldn't even try to push against the glass. I didn't sit back down on the sofa. My eyes darted frantically around the pristine living room. My purse was empty. My phone was locked in the credenza. But resting on the heavy antique coffee table, right where he had discarded it yesterday, was the massive, solid crystal whiskey decanter. Silas reached into the refrigerator, the hum of the appliance covering the microscopic sound of my stockinged feet moving across the hardwood. I picked up the decanter. It was incredibly heavy, the thick, cut glass digging painfully into my palms. I didn't think about the consequences. I didn't calculate the physics. I closed the distance in 3 silent, sprinting strides. Silas started to turn, the peripheral motion catching his eye just a fraction of a second too late. I swung the crystal decanter with every single ounce of terrifying, adrenaline-fueled strength I possessed. The heavy glass connected with the side of his skull with a sickening, wet crack. The decanter shattered instantly, exploding into a shower of brilliant, jagged shards across the granite kitchen island. Silas let out a sharp, guttural roar of pain, his massive frame violently, pitching sideways. He crashed hard into the stainless steel stove. His bare forearm slammed directly against the searing hot open burner he had just ignited. The sickening hiss of scorching flesh filled the air, mingling with the metallic clatter as his dead weight dragged a row of heavy copper pans down to the floor. He hit the hardwood heavily, stunned, bleeding, and clutching his severely burned arm. I didn't run for the keys. I didn't run for the door. The 3 years of exhausting, paranoid running, the suffocating grief of losing my life, and the absolute violating betrayal of the last month all suddenly mutated into a blinding, white-hot rage. I threw myself on top of him. I straddled his chest, my hands clamping violently around his thick throat. He was still disoriented from the blow, his amber eyes completely unfocused as blood poured into his dark hair. I squeezed with everything I had. My thumbs pressed brutally into his windpipe. I wanted to break the foundation. I wanted to watch the architect choke on his own brilliant design. He groaned, his massive hands coming up to weakly grip my wrists. But I didn't let go. I leaned my entire body weight forward, screaming something unintelligible, my vision completely tunneling into a dark, violent red. I never even heard the footsteps behind me. Something incredibly heavy and entirely unyielding slammed brutally into the back of my head. The sickening crunch echoed inside my own skull. The violent red tunnel instantly shattered into absolute blackness. My grip on Silas's throat failed completely as my body went entirely limp, sliding off his chest and collapsing onto the cold hardwood floor. A high-pitched, deafening ringing drowned out the sound of the freezing rain outside. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. My cheek was pressed against the floorboards, directly in a pool of Silas's blood. Through the rapidly shrinking pinprick of my fading consciousness, a pair of wet, scuffed leather boots stepped casually into my line of sight. My eyes sluggishly tracked upward. The familiar dripping hem of a tan raincoat. A thick silver bracelet I had helped pick out for a birthday present. The messy, chaotic knot of hair. Elena. My lungs seized. My eyes went impossibly wide, locked onto the face of the only person in the city I had trusted. She wasn't looking at me with panic or fear. She was looking down at me with cold, detached observation, holding a heavy iron fireplace poker in her right hand. Beside me, Silas groaned, rolling slowly onto his side, cradling his blistered, burned arm against his chest. He spat a mouthful of blood onto the floor and looked up at her. His voice was raw and strained from the pain, but the arrogant, clinical amusement was entirely back. "Well," Silas rasped, dragging himself up against the base cabinets.
Took you long enough to get here.
A broken, ragged gasp tore out of my throat. My lips parted, scraping against the bloody floorboards. "Why?" I whispered, the word dissolving into a weak, pathetic hiss. Elena didn't blink. And then the world went completely, absolutely dark.
Epilogue. The apartment smelled sharply of copper, burnt flesh, and industrial bleach. I knelt on the cold hardwood floor of the kitchen, methodically sweeping the jagged, brilliant shards of the shattered crystal decanter into a neat pile. I moved efficiently, ignoring the heavy smears of drying blood that had soaked into the knees of my jeans. Across the room, Silas sat rigidly on the edge of the plush leather sofa. The apartment was dead silent save for the harsh, rhythmic sound of him tearing medical tape with his teeth. He was wrapping his violently blistered forearm in thick white gauze. The heavy iron fireplace poker rested casually on the cushion right next to him. He finished wrapping the burn and let his arm drop heavily into his lap, his jaw tight. He looked exhausted. He looked entirely human. I stood up, dumping the shattered crystal into the trash can, and walked over to the granite island. I grabbed the damp towel and started scrubbing the blood from the floorboards. "She almost had you," I said softly, not looking up from the red stain. "I underestimated her survival instinct," Silas rasped, his voice still hoarse from where her thumbs had bruised his windpipe. He touched his throat gingerly. "She's stronger than the last one." "She's feral," I corrected, tossing the bloody towel into the sink. I turned and looked down the quiet hallway. The heavy oak door to the master bedroom was firmly shut, the new steel deadbolt I had installed yesterday completely engaged. There wasn't a single sound coming from the other side of the wood. Clara was still unconscious in the dark. "The feral ones are the only ones worth keeping," Silas said. The arrogant, clinical smoothness was bleeding back into his tone as he stared down the hallway at the locked door. "They hold the foundation better once you finally break them." I leaned against the kitchen counter, crossing my arms over my damp raincoat. I didn't feel an ounce of pity. I didn't feel a shred of guilt for the panicked, broken girl waking up alone in the dark vault. "Well," I said, my voice perfectly flat as I looked back at the architect. "The demolition is finished. I hope you're ready for the renovation."
Thank you for listening to The Golden Tether. Like and subscribe for part 2.